Have you ever wondered what it was like to be worshipped as a god and feared like a curse? Tonight we step into the hidden lives of Egypt's pharaohs, where gold masked fear and power came with a price. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? If you enjoy quiet, strange journeys into the past, like this video, subscribe, and let's drift back into a world the desert never forgot. Now, let's begin. The god kings awaken. The sun rises slowly over the Nile, not in a blaze but in a quiet breath of gold and amber. The river, still and glass-like in the earliest hour, carries the first light between rows of papyrus and date palms. Along its banks, barefoot fishermen pull in nets with the same practiced rhythm passed down for 1,000 years. Birds scatter from the reeds, their calls sharp against the hush of morning. Far away from the riverbanks and clay brick homes of common folk, hidden behind walls of polished limestone, something else awakens. Here stands the palace of the pharaoh, the living god. Its doors are guarded not only by soldiers but by silence, ceremony and fear. The palace is not meant to feel lived in, but eternal. Its corridors are lined with painted gods and scenes of conquest, each step echoing through vast halls built to feel timeless. No breeze touches this place, no ordinary voice rises above a whisper. In the heart of this structure, beneath a ceiling painted with stars, the pharaoh stirs. His waking is not his own, it is curated, sacred. Before he opens his eyes, servants move like shadows through his chamber. They bring bowls of scented water and oils thick with frankincense and myrrh. His body, already hairless, is rubbed with resin to guard against decay, a daily reminder that even gods must think of death. Musicians wait just outside, blind harpists playing softly, not for beauty, but for balance. Sound, scent, and touch must all align before the divine can rise. Eventually, he does. Shaven smooth, coal-lined eyes blinking in the half-dark, the pharaoh emerges like a statue come to life. His limbs are anointed, his jewelry chosen with precision. Every bracelet, every bead has meaning, protection, blessing, illusion. Around his neck gleams a broad collar of turquoise and lapis. Atop his head, the ceremonial crown gleams with polished gold and a cobra poised to strike. To his people, he is not a man, he is Nesu-Biti, he of the sedge and bee, the divine ruler, the shepherd of Egypt, the chosen of Ra. But behind closed doors he is weary. He has not slept deeply in years. The day begins not with food, but with offerings to gods older than memory. In a private sanctuary, he pours cool wine into alabaster bowls, breaks bread in perfect halves, and recites hymns passed down by priests whose grandfathers served kings long buried. Each word matters, each gesture secures the fragile balance of the world. He is not simply praying, he is upholding the very fabric of creation. Afterward, the pharaoh seats himself upon a gilded throne. His vizier, a man robed in white and aged by both duty and fear, begins to recite the petitions of the day. Disputes between landowners, requests from temple officials, reports of grain storage, of river levels, of border patrols. These are the quiet mechanics of empire, the invisible strings the pharaoh must tug to keep the land whole. Yet no one truly advises him. They offer suggestions, yes, but no one decides but him. His word is final, his glance can damn, and that is a heavy crown to wear. Beyond the walls of the palace, his image is everywhere, carved 20 feet high into sandstone cliffs, etched into temple gates, painted on tomb ceilings. He is shown smiting enemies, offering lotus blossoms to gods, striding confidently into the afterlife. Always calm, always certain, but that is only the surface. Beneath the gold and granite lies a truth far stranger. The pharaoh does not rule alone. He rules with the constant pressure of priests, advisors, family, especially family. In the royal household, danger is not found in rebellion or enemy invasion. It is found over dinner. Brothers raised to be rivals, wives who are also sisters, sons who must prove themselves before their father's body has cooled. It is an endless performance of loyalty and quiet threat, love poisoned by ambition. In these halls, a kind word can be as dangerous as a knife, a glance can mean exile, or worse. Even the queen, the great royal wife, knows this game. She too was likely born of the same blood, her lineage twisted and pure, a tangle of sacred marriage designed to preserve the divine line. But even she is not safe. Beneath her scented skin and painted eyes, calculations are always unfolding. Which sun will rise? Which rival must fall? Outside, in the heat of midday, the pharaoh rides through Thebes in a golden chariot. His people cheer. They scatter petals in his path. They bow so low their foreheads touch the dust. They believe he holds the favor of the gods in his hands. He waves slowly, never smiling, always watching. The parade passes obelisks etched with prayers, temples where priests chant his name, courtyards where statues of past kings look down with blank eternal eyes. He is reminded constantly, "You are the sun," but the sun sets, evening comes. He retreats to his private chamber. The walls are cool, the ceiling stars glow faintly in the flicker of oil lamps, dancers move like reeds in the wind, harps play soft and slow. He drinks date wine from a cup shaped like a lotus, and speaks quietly with his high priest about omens, dreams and the movements of stars. But even in this moment of calm, he thinks of death. His tomb is already being built, far to the west, in a hidden valley. Stonecutters carve deep into the rock. Artists paint images of his soul journeying through fire, sky and shadow. He funds it not with coin, but with grain, labor, and time. He knows he must be buried well, or be lost forever. In Egypt, death is not the end, but it is not gentle, either. And so the God King lies back, eyes half closed, thinking not of the people who love him, but of those who will outlive him. The palace of eternal sunlight, dawn in Thebes, does not arrive with sudden light, but with a slow golden hush. Beyond the reed-lined banks of the Nile, in a palace that glows like fire beneath the rising sun, the pharaoh awakens, not to the sounds of birdsong or family, but to ritual. Silence walks before him, always, silence, and then the scrape of sandals on limestone, as his attendants begin the sacred rhythms of his day. He does not dress himself. That would be unthinkable. Instead, his body is tended to by chosen hands, washed with scented water, drawn from sacred wells, oiled with unguents pressed from blue lotus and myrrh, and shaved clean of every hair. Cleanliness, after all, is not a preference, it is a requirement of the gods. Over his eyes goes kohl, drawn in black sweeping lines to ward off the evil eye, and reflect the heat of the sun. Around his wrists, rings of electrum and lapis. Over his chest, a collar of gold and turquoise, heavy as law. And when all is ready, he is wrapped in linen, the color of crushed sunlight, stitched by temple women, who chant names of gods with every pass of the needle. He does not speak. His words are too precious to be wasted on dressing. Only when the crown touches his brow, this morning, it is the double crown, white and red, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, does he finally rise. And when he steps into the colonnaded hall, all fall silent, for he is not a man, he is Horus, he is divine, and the divine does not walk among mortals without reason. But within, the pharaoh is not untouched by fear. He knows the truth whispered behind closed doors, that kings are only gods so long as the gods allow it. One failed harvest, one military defeat, one illness hidden behind a painted smile, and the throne wobbles beneath even the strongest of kings. So the ceremonies begin. His first act of the day is not governance. It is worship, always worship. He enters the inner chamber of the temple barefoot, stepping across cool alabaster. The statue of Amun-Ra towers above him, carved from ebony, inlaid with gold. Priests chant in low tones, smoke curls upward from burning myrrh, and the air feels heavy with presence, as if something watches from just behind the veil of this world. The pharaoh bows, he pours wine, he offers food, he speaks a blessing so old, its meaning has long since faded, but still he speaks it, because to stop would be to tempt the silence to answer back. Only once the gods are fed, does the court gather. The vizier stands first, a scroll in hand. He speaks of grain quotas in the delta, of a village that has gone 3 months without rain. Another scribe reads from a clay tablet. An envoy from Kush has arrived, bearing gifts and veiled threats. There are border tensions to the north, a collapsed granary, a suspicious death in the priesthood of Porta. The pharaoh listens to all. His face never changes. He does not blink. He is trained not to. Every word must pass through his judgment, for his word is law, and yet even he knows the truth. The more he speaks, the more he reveals. So often he says nothing, and in the silence, decisions are made. Later he rides out. The chariot gleams beneath the sun. Horses stomp and snort, impatient to run. Citizens crowd the streets, shouting praises and throwing garlands of flowers. Children press their foreheads to the dust. Old women weep, and still, the pharaoh does not smile, because this parade is not joy. It is reminder. It is proof that the gods walk among them. That power is not invisible, but the pharaoh knows what they do not. He is never alone. Beside every triumph rides a whisper of danger, a servant who listens too closely, a cousin with ambition, a priest who sees too much. He has watched others fall, once divine, now forgotten, even their names chipped from stone. So he does what he must. He builds. Another temple rises beside the river, ordered in haste, carved with symbols of eternity. He blesses a new obelisk, inscribed with his deeds. Another shrine, another feast, another offering, all to ensure the gods remember him kindly. Because in the world of the pharaohs, memory is the only defense against death, and death, he knows, is never far. Tomorrow, perhaps, he will consult the dream interpreters, or visit the necropolis, or summon the high priest for a private rite. He has questions that the living cannot answer. But for now, the sun still shines, and as the city of Thebes glows beneath the gold of Ra, the god-king stands tall atop the palace stairs, arms outstretched, casting a shadow long and sharp across the stone. Even shadows, here, are sacred. The House of Hidden Sorrows. Beneath the dazzling brightness of Egypt's holy courtyards, beneath the white walls of temples that glimmered like sunlit bone, there existed a darker layer of the kingdom, a place where sunlight did not reach, where incense clung to the stone like mist, where names were whispered rather than spoken, and silence was a language of its own. It was not a tomb, though many mistook it for one. This was the Per Ankh, the House of Life. But within its innermost rooms, the oldest priests called it something else, the House of Sorrows. It stood not far from the palace, hidden behind rows of sycamore fig trees whose leaves never turned in the wind. Its doorway was plain, its walls unpainted, as though it wished to be forgotten. Most Egyptians never even glanced at it, but the pharaohs knew it well. They came here when their dreams began to turn, when the gold felt heavy, when the statues no longer smiled. The House of Sorrows held texts so old that their ink had turned to dust, scrolls bound in reed and leather, sealed with wax that bore no known sigil, words written in the language before hieroglyphs, in strokes so fine the eye ached to follow them. They were not for decoration, they were for protection. Within these rooms sat the Sesh Per Ankh, the scribes of life and death, pale men with stained fingers, their eyes lined with sleepless years, their voices always just above a whisper. They wrote by oil lamp, surrounded by jars of resin, pigments ground from crushed turquoise and malachite, ash from sacred trees, and water pulled from deep beneath the desert. They did not serve men, they served the crossing, and it was here that a pharaoh once came in secret, long after midnight. There were no trumpets, no gold fans or sandal bearers, just a hooded figure, his face drawn with something colder than fear. He carried with him a strip of linen, soft and yellowed with time, embroidered with a single image, one familiar to all Egyptians, the scarab, a symbol of rebirth, of eternity. But this scarab had no eyes. The pharaoh placed it on the stone table before the high lector priest, and did not speak for some time. At last he said only, "It came to me in my sleep. I awoke with it in my hands." The lector priest, oldest among the scribes, did not ask questions. Instead, he motioned for the fire to be lowered. He scattered fine blue powder across the stone, where it sparked briefly, then burned out. He took a small bronze blade, and sliced the air in a practiced motion, left, right, above, below. A ritual of opening, not of doors, but of understanding. The pharaoh closed his eyes, and from memory, he recited what he had seen. A field with no sun, a staircase without steps, a voice that called him by name, but not the name he used in the court, or even the one carved on his throne. It called to him with his true name, the one only the gods and the stars should know. And then, a silence so absolute it cracked the world open. When the dream ended, his skin was damp, and the scarab lay in his hands, where no one had placed it. The lector priest turned slowly toward the shelves. From the back of the room he retrieved 3 scrolls, wrapped in bark, sealed with obsidian wax. Few had touched them in living memory. He laid them side by side, and opened them with care. The Book of Gates, the Book of What is in the Duat, and the Book of the Hidden Chamber. These were not meant for the living. These were maps of a kind, but not of places, of trials, of thresholds, of terrors with names and shapes. They showed the journey a soul must take after death, each gate guarded by a question, each hour ruled by a god or something worse. The pharaoh leaned closer, the candlelight flickered against his face. One of the scrolls showed a faceless being, black as pitch, holding a sun disk in one hand and a burning star in the other. Its legs were coiled like serpents. Its chest bore a name that had been scratched out by an ancient blade. "It waits in the 12th hour," the priest murmured. the hour when the heart is weighed. But it was the scarab that troubled him most. A scarab with no eyes does not bring rebirth. It brings forgetting. Such a symbol had not been seen in generations, perhaps longer. It was a thing buried in forbidden chapters, described only in terms of warning. The eye of the scarab, a watcher of the dead that once seen, begins to unravel a name, and a pharaoh's name must live forever. The priests began to work, silently, precisely. They brewed black ink mixed with lotus oil and ground copper. They wrote new spells, not the common ones used in tombs or temples, but secret phrases to be hidden inside amulets and buried beneath the king's chamber floor. They composed a hymn that could only be sung once, a song whose melody was never recorded, passed by breath alone. They created a mask, smaller than a hand, carved from a single piece of lapis lazuli. Its eyes were left empty, a mirror to the dream, and when it was done, the pharaoh said nothing. He bowed his head once and left. The priests watched him go, then turned to the scarab cloth. They burned it in a bowl of frankincense, and buried the ash inside a sealed jar, labeled with a glyph that meant, "Do not remember." At dawn the scribes washed their hands and opened the windows to let in the first light. The house of sorrows became still again, as though nothing had happened, as though no king had knelt before ancient texts, begging to keep his soul whole. And somewhere beyond the desert, the voice in the pharaoh's dream whispered a different name, one the world was never meant to hear. The sand beneath the throne. Long before the first temple stone was laid in place, before the gods were carved with their falcon heads and cow horns, before the scrolls of law were penned and sealed, there was sand, endless, watching sand. It moved where it pleased. It swallowed forgotten cities, and buried footprints so deeply they would never be seen again. Beneath every monument, beneath every polished court of granite and gold, there was always sand. Beneath every throne, there was sand, too, waiting, listening. It is easy to forget that, in a land built by divine order, the throne was not just a seat of power, it was a promise, a fragile one. A throne could not stand without the weight of the land beneath it, but the land remembered things that kings wished it would forget. This chapter begins with a small room in the royal residence, not the grand throne hall open to foreign dignitaries and lotus-bearing servants, but a quiet chamber lined with stone benches and reed mats, a place where royal records were kept, not for ceremony, but for memory. Here sat a boy no older than 12, his feet barely touching the ground. His name was Userkur. He had been born in the palace, son of a royal cousin, and now found himself chosen as a companion to the young prince. It was a role of both privilege and burden. He was expected to know everything the prince knew, and more. While the other boys raced along the Nile's edge with fishing lines and painted shells, Userkur sat with scrolls, with old men who smelled of oil and old wood, their voices slow and dry as baked papyrus. One day, while studying a lineage list, Userkur paused. He noticed a gap in the names, a long, careful gap where an entire reign should have been, but there was nothing, just a horizontal line, then the name of a new king, as though one had vanished. He asked the scribe about it, his voice cautious. The scribe said nothing, not at first, then without lifting his eyes, he said quietly, "There is sand beneath the throne." Userkur thought it was a riddle. He asked again. The scribe closed the scroll, slowly, and told him a story, not found in any official record, not carved on any wall, a story of a king who ruled for only 7 months, a king who banned offerings to certain temples, who sealed a crypt that no one had opened since the time of the builders, who dreamed of fire every night, until his servants began to see soot on his fingers each morning. They said he began to walk barefoot at night, across the palace courtyards, whispering to the statues as if they were old friends. Then one morning, he was gone, not dead, gone. No body, no tomb, no ritual. His name was erased, scraped off cartouches, painted over in temple murals, but the sand remembered. They said that if you stood alone near the southern wall of the palace at night, you could hear footsteps beneath the stone, as if someone were still pacing, searching, trying to remember the way back. Userkur did not forget that story. Years passed. Userkur became royal steward under the next pharaoh, then high chamberlain after that. His duties placed him at the heart of the court, close enough to the throne to hear the secrets spoken beside it. And once during a festival to mark the king's jubilee, the ground in the outer courtyard cracked, a small fissure in the stone. Curious. Userkur had it investigated. The workers broke away the stone tiles. What they found was not a broken waterway or hollow chamber. They found an old stair, leading downward, a stair made of limestone blocks, carved with glyphs worn nearly smooth. Yuzaka went down alone. The air changed as he descended. It grew cooler, stiller. The sound of the palace above faded completely. At the bottom, he found a narrow hall with smooth walls, unpainted but polished to a sheen, and at the end of the hall, a single statue, not of a god or a king. It was a figure seated on a plain stool. Its face had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just the faint shape of a crown, and a small offering bowl placed at its feet. Inside the bowl was sand. Yuzaka stood very still. Something in his memory stirred. He whispered the words the old scribe had once said to him. "There is sand beneath the throne." The statue, of course, did not move, but behind it, carved very faintly on the wall, was a single name, a name that had been scraped away, then carved again, then scratched out again, over and over, layered in confusion, buried in fear. He ordered the chamber resealed. No inscription was made, no record entered. But that night, he returned alone, not as a steward, not as a chamberlain, as a man who had seen too many rains, and too many silences. He placed an offering in the bowl, not bread, not perfume, just a small handful of desert sand, brought from the western dunes near Abydos, and when he turned to go, he heard something, not with his ears, but inside his chest, a rhythm, a breath, the sound of someone still seated, still waiting to be remembered, or to be forgotten forever. Above, the palace continued on. Priests lit incense, scribes recorded victories, children played in the courtyards, but the sand beneath the throne did not move, not yet, and somewhere deep in the unmarked hours of the night, a king without a name opened his eyes again, and listened to the footsteps above him, wondering if one day they would lead back down to where he sat, still and silent, waiting for someone to remember that all thrones sit on shifting ground, and that nothing built in this world stays buried forever. The map without names. In a quiet room beneath the temple of Seshat, where the scent of crushed myrrh drifted like old memory through reed-covered vents, an aged scribe unfolded a scroll that had no title. Its surface was dry and cracking, too fragile to be moved, yet it demanded attention, not because of its artistry, for it had none. There were no gods drawn in flowing poses, no symbols of lotus or sun or feather, only a series of paths. Some curved like a serpent's body, others were jagged and broken, like hills shattered by old winds, but none of the lines were named. The scroll had been found during the reign of the third king, in a sealed chamber behind a false wall. No door had led there, no inscription hinted at its presence. The chamber had simply been discovered by accident, when a pillar cracked during repairs, and a low draught hissed through the break like something breathing. The priests called it the map without names. No one could say what it led to, or what it depicted. Some believed it was a path to the stars, a forgotten route of the soul beyond the Duat. Others feared it showed the old land, older even than Kemet, before the Nile had carved its rhythm into the stone and soil, a place the gods had tried to bury. The map was not shared with the court, not even the pharaoh knew of it. Only the lector priests and their inner circle, and the one boy chosen to copy it, by hand under the dim yellow flame of a single oil lamp. That boy was now a man. His hands bore the stain of 50 years of ink and resin, and his hair, once the color of date palms, had gone the hue of desert salt. But he remembered that first night clearly, the way the air had felt too cold for summer, the way his candle had refused to stay lit unless held low, and the way his heart had felt like it beat beside him, not within. He had copied the lines exactly, one curve at a time, but one line, he had never been able to trace. It was faint, nearly invisible. It shimmered just beneath the surface, like something painted with dust and fire. He could see it in his mind's eye even now, but never on the papyrus, and no matter how many times he looked, it remained hidden. A path not meant for hands. That was the path the pharaoh asked about now. It was early morning, the kind of soft dawn that barely touched the temple stones, and the king, aged and quiet, had come not as ruler, but as a seeker. His robes were plain. He wore no gold, just a carved wooden amulet at his throat, shaped like the papyrus flower. "I dreamed of a city," he said, "but the streets had no names." The scribe nodded once, not surprised. The older pharaohs always found their way here eventually, when they began to hear music in silence, when their reflections lingered too long in still water, when the statues of their youth seemed to look back with pity. not pride. The pharaoh looked down at the old scroll. Do you know where it leads? The scribe hesitated before answering. I believe it leads to the edge of memory, to what was forgotten before forgetting began. The pharaoh did not speak again for a long while. He studied the lines with a stillness that only age and grief can bring. He did not try to touch the scroll. He knew better. But his gaze followed the curves, the rises, the sudden breaks, and paused, like so many others had, at the place where the line vanished. There is no ink there, he said. No, said the scribe. That path is walked only by those who are already forgetting. The pharaoh's hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He was not old in body, but he had begun to lose time. Small pieces at first, a name he once loved, a tune he could no longer hum, a door in the palace he could not recall having passed, though it led to his own garden. I forget the taste of honey, he said softly, almost to himself. I forget the word for river. The scribe did not offer comfort. It was not his role. Instead he stood and moved slowly to a clay chest in the corner. From it he withdrew a new scroll, blank, and a sharpened reed pen. He placed both before the pharaoh. When the line calls you, he said gently, write what you see. The king nodded, not fully understanding, but too weary to question. He took the pen and held it like a sword, though his battles now were not with men, but with shadows. That evening, the pharaoh returned to the palace, and did not speak of the map again. But in the nights that followed, the servants noticed him walking the gardens alone, whispering names they did not know, names that had not passed Egyptian lips in 1,000 years. He began sketching shapes in the dust, circles within spirals, staircases without steps, rivers that flowed upward toward the stars. Once he stood before a statue of Osiris for hours, not praying, not bowing, but simply watching, as if waiting for something beneath the stone to stir. The scroll he had taken remained blank for many weeks. Then one morning, the scribes found it resting on the throne, a single line drawn across its surface. It was not written in ink. It was pressed into the papyrus, like a path carved not with pen, but by pressure, by memory returned from some place far beyond the tomb. The line matched the one the scribe had never been able to trace, the path unseen, and beside it, in trembling script, the pharaoh had written only, "This is the way back, if the stars forget me." And no one saw the king again after that season. Some say he went into the desert alone, as kings once did in the time before pyramids. Others believe he walks the line still, between memory and the unknown, seeking the name he lost before he was ever crowned. And in the temple of Seshet, the old scribe waits. The scrolls remain, and the map without names still holds its silence. But now, if you look closely, the faint line glimmers, just slightly, in the early morning light, as though someone, somewhere, is still walking it. The keeper of the western sky. There was a place beyond the river, past the farmlands and date groves, where the stone turned redder and the wind tasted of copper. The villagers never went there, not even in daylight. The priests had no shrines upon its hills, and even the desert jackals gave the cliffs a wide path, as though guided by instinct older than memory. This was the western ridge, known only in certain circles as Akhet, the horizon beyond the horizon. It was not marked on any scroll, not named on the maps carved in the palaces of kings, but its presence was known among the oldest scribes and the stargazers who tracked the gods across the sky. For while the Nile flowed in green and blue beneath the sun's open eye, it was here, among the red rocks and deep shadow, that another kind of watching took place. Here lived the keeper. His name was not written. His title was not spoken aloud, but among the inner order of temple seers, those who served not the people, nor even the gods, but time itself, there was an understanding that certain questions could not be asked near Akhet, and certain answers could only be received there. The keeper had no servants, no guards. He wore no golden collar, no headdress of hawk or serpent. He wore only linen robes dyed the color of sand after rain, and a necklace of carnelian beads that clinked faintly when he moved. He lived alone in a house of stone, half buried into the cliffside. At dusk he stood beneath the sky's orange veil, and watched the horizon. Not the horizon of the sun, but the one beyond it. For the keeper's duty was simple. He watched the passage of names. You see, the Egyptians believed that to live forever, one must be remembered. The tombs and temples, the statues, the songs, they were all forms of memory, names carved deep so that they could not be erased. But over time, even stone forgets, even scrolls crumble, and when a name is lost in both tongue and text, it begins to pass through the western sky. The keeper alone could see them. They came not as letters or words, but as forms of light, shapes no eye was meant to follow. Some were bold, gleaming like the first hour of dawn. Some were faint, flickering like a candle at the end of a long corridor. And some were broken. Those were the names that had been cursed, struck from every record, forbidden by decree or silenced by fear. It was the keeper's role to take the final measure of each. If a name held weight, if it burned steady and bright, it would rise, disappear into the stars and be born anew, somewhere in the cycle beyond time. But if a name stuttered, if it changed shape mid-flight, if it hissed or shivered in his vision, then the keeper would take the small bowl of ochre that sat by his side and mark a line on the cliff wall beside him. One line, then another, crossed out, forgotten, a tally of all those who would never be born again. No one knew how long the keeper had lived there. His face bore the marks of time, but his eyes were steady, always fixed on the horizon. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was always to the sky. He whispered names. Once long ago, a young apprentice came to find him, sent by the high temple, full of questions. Why do some names rise, he asked, and others fall? The keeper did not answer at first. Instead he pointed toward the east, where the sun was just beginning to dip behind the distant palms. There is no single sun, he said, only the memory of fire, only the shape it casts. The apprentice frowned, unsure, and then the keeper said something the apprentice never forgot. Even kings are only echoes, unless they are loved. From that day the apprentice returned every season, bringing offerings of fresh water and copper pigment, until one day the house in the cliff was empty. The carnelian beads remained, left in a circle upon the stone floor. No one took them. The winds around Akhet are strange. They do not follow the winds of the Nile, nor those of the desert. They move in silence, soft but insistent, like breath pulled through a deep lung. And sometimes, in the stillest moments, they carry names. Names that do not appear in any scroll. Names that were once shouted in courts and carved into tombs. Names that now have no one left to say them. But the keeper remembers. Even now, in the cool hush of twilight, when the stars begin to pulse in their ancient rhythms, something stirs beyond the edge of vision. It is not a wind. It is not a dream. It is a name. Yours, mine, a king's, a child's. One day, all names pass beneath the western sky, and the keeper will watch, and weigh, and decide whether the stars remember or forget. The Garden of Sealed Mouths. There was a garden hidden within the outer walls of the necropolis, just beyond the reach of the stonecutters and tomb painters. Not a grand palace garden, not a space of lotus ponds and pleasure sails. This garden was narrow, quiet, and carefully shielded by sandstone walls that curved inward, like a cupped hand held over something precious or dangerous. Only the high mortuary priests knew the gate, and even they approached it with silence in their steps. This was the Garden of Sealed Mouths. It grew in a strip of land that had once been riverbank, before the waters shifted and left it stranded. The soil was darker there, softer. A single channel of underground water still ran beneath it, cold and steady, feeding the roots of plants no one else touched. Papyrus with red stalks, creeping figs with heart-shaped leaves. A grove of sycamore saplings that never bore fruit, but kept growing, slim and reaching, toward a sun that never fully reached them. And in the center of it all was a stone pool, shallow, wide, and ringed with glyphs that had long since been rubbed smooth. There was no statue at the center, no fountain, just still water that never overflowed, never dried. The garden was tended by one woman. She had no title carved upon any stela, no robes of rank, no house in the city. She was simply called Nebat Mort, Lady of Silence. No one knew her age, or if the same woman had held the post for generations. She wore no jewelry, only white linen that draped like mist around her limbs. Her face was calm, but her eyes held the kind of stillness one finds in deep caves, or in the eyes of jackals at dusk. She did not speak. She did not need to. For the Garden of Sealed Mouths was not a place of conversation. It was a place of storage, not of scrolls, or jars, or bones, but of names. You see, there were times in the long history of Egypt when a name had to be locked away, not destroyed, not forgotten, but buried in such a way that it could not call out. Some of these names belonged to enemies of the state, others to those who had committed unspeakable violations of Ma'at, the balance of order and truth. And some belonged to loved ones lost too suddenly, whose memory became too painful to carry. A sealed name, once placed in the garden, could no longer be used. It could not be summoned in ritual. It could not be spoken over offerings. It was as though the person had stepped sideways into a corridor that did not lead to life, nor to death, only silence. The ritual was precise. The name would be written on a thin slip of linen, soaked in myrrh and folded 7 times. It would then be laid upon a smooth shard of black basalt, one of the stones pulled from the sacred ridge beyond the floodplain. The stone was placed at the base of a fig tree, or just beside the pool, and pressed into the earth with a bare hand. No tools, no words, only the warmth of skin, and a bowed head. Nebat-Mort alone knew where each name was buried, and she never forgot. Some nights, long after the stars had climbed into their sacred forms, she would walk the edge of the garden barefoot, trailing her fingers along the plants. Sometimes she would pause by one tree, or crouch near a root, and there, for a breathless moment, she would listen, not for sound, but for the silence that followed a name. For even sealed, a name still hummed beneath the surface of the world. One year, in the reign of a boy king, whose crown was heavier than his shoulders, a priest of high standing came with a name sealed in gold thread. It had been written by a trembling hand. It belonged to the king's uncle, who had once held the throne himself before vanishing under the weight of scandal. They asked Nebat-Mort to bury it under the pool, a rare request. She said nothing, only took the name, wrapped it again, and walked the edge of the water. It was the only time the pool's surface trembled. Later that same season, the young king's dreams became still again. His heart, the physician said, grew quieter in his chest. The statues no longer wept. The sealed name had done its work. But not all names stay quiet. There are stories passed between the night guards at the necropolis gates, of voices heard just outside the garden walls. Not cries, not threats, just a whisper, curling like smoke over the stones, calling, always, for the one who buried them. Nebat-Mort hears them. She simply lays a hand against the fig tree's bark, or the edge of the basalt pool, and waits until the silence returns. It always does, and in the end, when her own name has been written, folded, pressed and laid beneath the oldest sycamore in the garden, no priest will come to read it back. No stone will bear her face, but the silence she guarded will remain, still as deep water, still as the moment between the heart's 2 beats, and the names, sealed forever in the garden soil, will sleep in peace, whispering only to the roots, and to the silence that remembers. The Archivist of Breath? You wouldn't notice it at first. There's no columned entryway or towering statue to mark its presence, no inscription announcing gods or kings. From the distance, it might seem like just another crease in the sandstone cliffs that line the desert's western edge, where the winds grow sharp and the light begins to burn a little differently. But if you step closer, carefully, minding your breath, you'll find a doorway carved straight into the rock, barely shoulder wide, with edges worn smooth by time and wind. This is the entrance to Epet Keniu, the closed sanctuary. It is not a temple, though it's older than most. It is not a tomb, though it holds memories heavier than stone. It is something else entirely. Inside, the air is cool and still. The passage narrows and then opens into a low chamber, lit only by narrow slits cut high into the rock. The light is soft and never sharp. It falls in dust-filled ribbons that seem to move only when you aren't looking directly at them. Along the walls, carved shelves cradle hundreds, maybe thousands of scrolls, each one wrapped in linen, sealed with a circle of clay impressed with a single mark, a wave, traced by fingertip. This is a library unlike any other, not a record of laws or lineage, not a vault of secrets belonging to dynasties long past. No, these scrolls hold only one kind of thing: breaths. Each scroll is a record of a breath taken at the edge of life and death, a final exhale, a sacred inhale, the soft, rattling moment just before silence. Some scrolls document the last breath of a high priest, others, the first breath of a newborn under a harvest moon. Some are ordinary, if such a thing exists, recorded from farmers, potters, or servants whose names no longer echo through the halls of the living. But here, their breath is remembered, and only one man tends this place. The scribes call him Hek-Shittim, the Archivist of Breath. No one remembers when he arrived, or even if he ever truly did. Some say he's been here longer than the scrolls themselves. His skin is the color of papyrus aged by flame, and his eyes are as pale as dust. He wears no ring of rank, no necklace of priesthood, just a collar of twisted reed, and robes clean but faded by time. He speaks little, and when he does, his voice sounds like dried papyrus rubbed between thumb and forefinger. But his silence is not cold, it's patient, observing, listening. He keeps no guards, he has no attendants, only scrolls, and time. Visitors do come, but never often, and never more than one at a time. One morning, A grieving daughter arrived with a basket of dried lotus petals and a single copper amulet belonging to her father. She told the archivist how her father passed as the sun touched the top of the tamarisk tree outside their home, how his last breath had been warm and long, as if he had finally exhaled something he'd carried his whole life. The archivist listened, and then unwrapped a fresh scroll. He dipped his pen in dark ink mixed with myrrh and red ochre, and began to write. The name, the time, the feel of the breath, its rhythm, its purpose. When she left, the basket was lighter, though she had taken nothing from it. Another day, a boy barely older than 15 knelt in the entrance with tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. His master, a temple musician, had collapsed during the evening chorus. The archivist offered no comfort, only a space to speak. The boy described the strange shudder of the last note, how the breath had left not with a cry, but a hush. It was enough. The archivist wrote it down. Each breath is sacred, he would sometimes whisper, though not always aloud. Each breath is a gate. The shelves behind him stretched deeper than the eye could follow. New rows opened as needed, carved from the stone by quiet tools and older rituals. The breaths were kept, not by rank or alphabet, but by rhythm. There was a shelf for fast breaths, cut short, another for shallow breaths lost to fever, another for sighs taken in relief, as death was welcomed, and then there was the sealed room at the very back. Few knew of it, even fewer had ever seen it. Inside were only 3 scrolls. One bore a name that no longer translated into any known tongue, another was wrapped in black linen, and sealed in wax so old it had turned to stone. The third bore no seal at all. It was said these were the first breaths recorded by man, not taken from the dying, but from the world itself, the moment the wind first moved across the Nile, the moment the sun drew steam from the earth, the moment a god inhaled before speaking creation. The archivist did not record these things as history, he recorded them as memory, not his, the world's. There were rumors of other kinds of scrolls too, dangerous ones. A set of 7, hidden among the thousands, written in invisible ink and bound in leather, made from unknown beasts. They held the breaths of those who never died properly, the cursed, the disturbed, the ones whose breath had been taken, but not offered. No one was meant to read those scrolls, not even the archivist. Still, some nights, a wind would press itself against the sanctuary walls, and he would pause his writing to listen, not to the storm outside, but to something quieter, a soft, familiar rhythm, the breath of something ancient, waiting to be remembered. The keeper of the outer courtyard. The temple complex stood quiet before dawn, its long courtyard stretching like ancient ribs beneath a sky just beginning to soften with blue. The pillars, painted once in ochre and lapis, had long faded in the desert wind, but their forms remained unbroken, tall, solemn, and unchanging. They were not merely decorations, they were echoes of something older than memory, older even than the myths scratched into their surfaces. Each morning, before the priests stirred from their chambers, and before the incense was lit in the sacred halls, there was one figure who moved first. Not a high priest, not a prince. A man with a limp, a quiet step, and a long memory. He was the keeper of the outer courtyard. No one quite remembered when he had begun his duties, and no one could say how old he truly was. His skin was the color of worn papyrus, and his eyes bore the same faded gold as the edge of a once polished obelisk. Some said he had once been a soldier in the service of a forgotten pharaoh. Others said he had always been here, part of the stone itself. His role, though never spoken of in ceremonies, was vital. Before prayers were whispered, before offerings were laid at the feet of the gods, the keeper passed through each passage of the outer court, whispering something to the pillars, to the earth, and to the air. A greeting, a recognition, a permission, perhaps. Only once those silent words had been spoken, could the rituals begin. He carried no staff of office, wore no collar of rank, only a narrow strip of linen tied around one wrist, worn soft with age and stained faintly with what might have once been blue dye. No one knew its meaning, no one asked. Each morning, he paused beneath the same fig tree that grew crooked at the edge of the courtyard, its roots cracked through the paving stones, its branches reaching always to the east, as if remembering something from long ago. Beneath this tree, he sat in silence for several minutes, pressing one hand to the ground. It was said he was listening, not for the gods, but for the voices beneath, voices that did not use words. The courtyard was not only a place of passage, it was a threshold. Those who lived within the inner sanctum walked over it daily, never wondering what lay beneath. But the keeper knew. He felt it in the soles of his feet, in the shiver that ran up his spine each time he swept the floor in slow circular movements, always clockwise, never widdershins. He kept a key of dark bronze, worn flat from use. It unlocked nothing visible. One morning, before the sun had broken over the palace walls, a boy, an apprentice scribe, wandered into the courtyard too early. His master had sent him for a lost scroll, but the boy had taken a shortcut through the columns, curious to see the temple when it was still wrapped in silence. There, among the long shadows, he saw the keeper standing completely still before a wall where no doorway should have been. The man whispered something, and pressed his palm to the stone. For just a moment, something shimmered, like a mirage, like water, and the boy thought he saw the outline of a stairwell leading down. The boy gasped, and the sound echoed too loudly. The keeper turned. He said nothing. He only looked at the boy, long and calm, then beckoned him forward. The boy hesitated, but obeyed. Together they stood before the wall. The shimmer was gone. The stairwell, if it had ever been real, was vanished. But the keeper looked not at the stone, but at the sky. "You saw nothing," he said in a voice like worn leather. "But you felt it, that is enough." He told the boy to remember that some places are kept hidden not by walls, but by silence, that some duties are not written in scrolls, that even gods have their secrets, and even secrets have their guardians. The boy returned to the scribe's quarters, his scroll forgotten, his heart full of questions he would never dare ask aloud. From that day on, he greeted the keeper with a small bow each morning. Others thought it odd, but the keeper only nodded once in return, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Years passed. Sandstorms came and went. The priests changed. The walls were repainted. Names of kings were chiseled out and recarved. But the keeper remained, and beneath the fig tree, he continued to listen, each dawn, each dusk, until one morning, he was simply not there. No one had seen him leave. No one had noticed anything different. Only the apprentice, now grown, now a scribe of middle years, saw it. A faint print in the sand beneath the tree, where a single bronze key had been left behind, and beside it, a piece of linen, faded, threadbare, stained blue. The scribe picked it up carefully. He said nothing, but from that morning on, he passed through the courtyard just before dawn, pausing under the fig tree, pressing one hand to the ground, not speaking, just listening. The temple went on. Incense rose, statues gleamed, but the stone remembered, and somewhere, just beyond the visible, a stairwell waited, a door that only opened for silence, a keeper, never named, and the secret work of watching continued. The garden beneath the water. There was a story rarely told and never written down, about a place where no wind touched the ground and no sound returned when called. It was not hidden behind gates or guarded by soldiers. In fact, it was not far from the heart of the city, just past the fisherman's quarter, down a slope of broken sandstone steps, where the air grew colder by degrees, and the smell of the river began to change. Here lay a shallow basin once used to gather floodwaters during the High Nile, a place long forgotten when newer canals were built. The locals called it the Quiet Hollow, but in temple texts, those few that hinted at it, it was known as Nemu's Basin, named for a priestess, who vanished without a trace nearly 3 centuries before. It looked, at first glance, like a neglected garden, a wide hollow of reeds and soft mud, surrounded by crumbled stone blocks and crooked acacia trees. But if you stepped down carefully into the basin, past the edge where frogs no longer sang, you would notice something strange. Your footsteps didn't echo, and your breath seemed to hang too long in the air, as if the place itself was thinking about you. No one lived there, no birds nested in the trees. The plants grew in patterns, concentric circles, as if drawn by a scribe's compass. In the middle of it all, half buried in silt and moss, was a small carved slab of red granite. Its surface was unmarked, yet oddly polished. It was here, long ago, that a young apprentice named Mehen stumbled by accident. He had not meant to come this far. He'd been sent by his grandmother to fetch herbs near the canal's edge, and had followed the wrong path. What brought him down the steps of Quiet Hollow that day, he never understood. But something in the stillness called to him, not with words, but with a feeling, a kind of familiarity he could not explain. Mehen was not a fearful child, but even he hesitated when he reached the bottom and felt how still the air had become. Even the insects had stopped their song. There was only the faint sound of dripping, though no water moved. He stepped toward the center, and when he placed his hand upon the red stone, he felt it, cold, smooth, impossibly still. Then, very faintly, he saw something. Just a flicker, a shimmer in the reeds, as though a wall of water had passed between him and the world. for just an instant. Startled, he backed away, and for a moment he thought he saw a garden. Not the one of reeds and mud, but one of columns made from glass, and flowers that turned with no wind. There were people moving inside it, slowly, as if under water, but he could not see their faces, and then it was gone. He blinked, and the garden vanished. He never told his grandmother, but he returned, again and again. Not out of curiosity, out of quiet comfort. Each time he would sit by the red stone. Sometimes he saw the garden again, just briefly, shimmering at the edges of vision, sometimes not. But he always left feeling calmer, as if he had remembered something without realizing it. Years passed. Mehan grew into a man, a gardener by trade. He tended the temple courtyards, planted vines against sandstone walls, and was known for coaxing stubborn fig trees into bloom. He never married, never left the city, but he always found time, just before sunset, to walk alone. One evening, as he grew older, and his joints began to ache, he returned to Quiet Hollow for what he felt might be the last time. The red stone was there, unchanged. He sat beside it, closed his eyes. The air grew thick, the shimmer returned, and this time, the garden came into full view. It was not imagined. It was there. He could hear it, hear the water moving without sound, the leaves brushing in a wind he could not feel. And there, at the edge of the path, stood a woman in white linen, with eyes that mirrored the sky before a storm. She looked at him, without surprise. "You've remembered," she said, though her lips did not move. He wanted to speak, but the words stayed in his throat like stone. She extended her hand, not as an invitation, but in welcome. And when Mehan reached out, he felt nothing, but he knew what it meant. He did not return home that night. The temple gardeners planted a fig tree where his tools were last seen, and the Quiet Hollow remained undisturbed. But those who passed nearby, particularly children, or the elderly, sometimes paused, as if they had heard something, just beneath the ground. A memory, a song, something just beginning to bloom. And the red stone in the center of the hollow, still polished, still warm at sunset, still waiting. The Archivist of Dust. In the far western quarter of Wasset, where the houses grew lower, and the streets turned narrow as river reeds, there stood a building no one entered by mistake. It had no sign, no guards. Its doorway was shaded by an ancient tree that bloomed only once a decade, and even then, only for a single night. Those who noticed it at all called it simply the House of Dust, though that was not its name. Its true name had been lost long ago, written only in a ledger buried beneath the floor, sealed in wax, and tied with a thread made of hair. But one man still knew it. He lived alone on the second floor behind a wall of cracked papyrus scrolls and crumbling clay tablets. No one remembered when he had moved in. Some claimed he had always been there since before the war with the Libyans. Others thought he might be a priest, or a scribe, or something older still. His skin was the color of worn limestone, his voice no louder than the sound of a moth's wing, and his fingers were always stained with red ochre. They called him the Archivist. Each morning, before the sun reached the city's rooftops, he would sweep the steps in perfect silence, not with a broom but with a fan of woven reeds, the kind used only in burial chambers. And each evening, as the last light slid behind the palms, he would light a single clay lamp and place it at the window, not to be seen, but to mark that the memory of the day had been received. He did not write stories. He stored them. The kind no one else dared to keep. The House of Dust was filled with the things others had tried to forget. Letters never delivered. Testimonies whispered under threat of death. Names scratched out of tombs, rebuilt syllable by syllable on pages made from the bark of ghost trees. He catalogued curses and cures alike, songs that had no melody, prayers to gods that had been erased from temple walls. His shelves held memories like bones, carefully arranged, labeled with care, sealed against decay. Sometimes, those in quiet grief would come to his door, not loudly, not often. They would leave a wrapped bundle by the step, a scrap of linen, an old carving, a single word etched into copper. Payment was never requested, but the archivist always accepted. He would carry the item inside, unwrap it with reverence, and record its story, whether or not it had one. He never left the city. He never grew older, it seemed. But one season, just after the new floods, he received something unlike anything before. A young girl, no older than 10, had come in the night. She did not knock. She simply stood there, barefoot, with a small clay bowl held in both hands. Inside the bowl was dust, not sand, not ash, dust, soft, fine and shimmering faintly, as if ground from crushed moonlight. She said only this: It came from the space beneath my mother's bed. She said to bring it to you if the dreams returned. The archivist nodded once. He took the bowl, bowed to the girl, and turned inside without a word. All night, he sat with the dust. He poured a single pinch into the fire, and watched how it burned. He stirred another into ink, and watched how it flowed, backward uphill. He placed a drop of oil upon it, and saw the flame curl inward instead of rising. And at last he wrote, not on papyrus, but on a slip of bone taken from the shelf behind him, blank for centuries, waiting for this. He wrote a name. It was not the girl's. It was a name older than kingship, older than the word for king. A name that had once been whispered only inside the chamber beneath the Black Pyramid, where even the priests walked backward as they left, and when the name was finished, the lamp flickered out, not from wind, from silence. The next morning, the archivist opened the window. He did not sweep the step. Instead he placed the clay bowl on the sill, filled it again with dust, only this time, it did not shimmer. It was black, and still. He waited. For 3 days no one came. But on the 4th, the girl returned. Her mother was gone, she said. Vanished. No sign of struggle, just a smear of pale grey powder where she had once slept. The archivist knelt before her, very gently. He offered her a small scroll, bound in red twine. Do not read this, he said. Bury it when you are ready. But not in earth, bury it in memory. The girl nodded. She did not cry, and when she left, she walked away slowly, not looking back. That evening, the house of dust glowed a little longer. The flame at the window burned until dawn, and far away, where the Nile curved like a sleeping serpent, a single petal fell from a tree that had not flowered in over 100 years. No wind stirred, no bird called, but the story remained, waiting as all stories do, for the right silence to be heard again. The man who spoke to statues. There was a man in the city of Memphis who had no title, no family, and no gods. He lived in a crumbling house at the edge of the craftsman's quarter, beside a dried canal lined with stones that had once marked a sacred way. The street outside had no name. The neighbors said little about him, and less to him. Yet once a month, without fail, the same thing would happen. He would vanish, and when he returned, something in the air seemed quieter. He was not a priest, not a magician. He wore no amulets. He never lit incense. He offered no prayers at the festival days, but he could speak to statues. That was what the children whispered, when they dared to linger by his doorway, that he could walk into a temple and hear what the stone would not say to anyone else, that his eyes were too quiet, and his ears too old for his age. The truth was not far from this. By trade, he was a restorer, one of the nameless men who patched the cracks in the temples after floods or sandstorms. He knew the scent of limestone dust, the way chipped pigment crumbled beneath a fingernail, the sound a statue made when it was hollowed at the core. But he also knew things the other workers did not. He knew that stone remembers, not in words, not in stories, but in the heat it holds after 1,000 hands have touched it, in the echo of breath inside a sealed chamber, in the dust trapped behind a god's eye, unmoved for generations. One evening, just after the last of the city's lamps had been snuffed, he entered the great temple of Potter, not through the front, where worshippers left offerings and prayers, but through a hidden stair behind the northern storeroom. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this many times. His feet made no sound, his hands disturbed no air. He made his way to the inner chamber, and there it waited. The statue of Potter, carved from obsidian too smooth to be natural, too dark to be described. It did not glimmer, it did not reflect. It absorbed light, noise, time. He stood before it in silence, no bow, no chant, just the breath of a man who had given up, asking the usual questions. After some time, he reached into his satchel and pulled out an old chisel, not of copper or bronze, but bone, worn smooth by years of use. He did not strike the statue, he tapped it, gently, 4 times. Then he placed his hand upon its chest and whispered, "I have come again." Nothing moved, but the air changed. He closed his eyes, waited, and the silence began to speak. Not in language, not in sound, but in pressure, in warmth, in something behind his ribs that felt like memory from a dream you forgot upon waking. He saw an offering table, covered in lotus petals and dried dates. He saw a doorway carved in the shape of a mouth. He saw a second statue, one he did not recognize. Its face was smooth, blank, not erased, but never given a name. He opened his eyes. The obsidian god remained unmoved. But on the floor, just beneath the statue's base, a single crack had opened, a fine, hair-thin fissure that had not been there before. He knelt and touched it. Dust clung to his fingers, not ordinary dust. It shimmered. He did not take it. He did not speak again. He left the temple the same way he came, the chisel wrapped once more in linen. That night, back in his house, he took out a long scroll. It was empty, except for one line at the top. The names that were not given. He added a mark, not a word, not a glyph, a shape. It was the face of the statue from his vision, featureless, waiting. Over the following weeks, he returned to other temples, Horus, Hathor, Khonsu. Each time he did not go to worship, he went to listen, and each time, the same pattern unfolded. Silence, presence, memory, and then the image of that smooth, nameless face, until, finally, he came to the temple of Set. It was smaller than the others, less revered, half forgotten even by the priests who claimed it. But inside, it pulsed with something older than devotion. He did not bring the chisel this time. He brought nothing. He simply entered, walked to the central hall, and looked up at the broken relief carved high in the wall, one that had been damaged in a storm decades ago. Most saw only fractured lines, but he saw something else. Behind the marks, behind the missing plaster, there was another carving, faint, worn, but whole. He touched the wall, whispered nothing, and for the first time in his years of listening, he felt the silence move into him, not a memory, a command. He stepped back, nodded, and in the days that followed, he did not return to his quiet home or to the stone-littered paths he had walked all his life. He went east, toward the desert, toward a place the temples would not name. He carried no offerings, no water, no tools, only the scroll, now bearing the marks of 10 nameless faces, waiting. And far behind him, in the statue halls of Memphis, a wind stirred through the mouths of the gods. They did not speak, but the silence no longer slept. The river that swallowed names. It was said that there was a bend in the Nile that no map marked, a place where the river changed its voice. To most, the Nile was a source of life, green reeds, soft silt, a ribbon of blue winding endlessly through stone and sand. But to those who had lived long enough, or listened well enough, there was another understanding. The river could give, yes, but it could also take. And what it took, it did not return. There were stories never told too loudly, about a village that had once stood at this hidden bend. It did not appear in the temple ledgers, no taxes were collected from it, no scribes ever visited, and yet every few decades someone would speak of it in passing, always an old fisherman or a half-blind oarsman, muttering over a bowl of lentils or date wine. They called it by different names, but the meaning was always the same, the village that forgot itself. According to these whispers, the people who lived there believed something different about the afterlife. They did not speak of judgment halls or scales weighed against feathers. They did not offer prayers to Osiris or prepare elaborate tombs. Instead, they lived as if the world beyond death were just another village, distant, yes, but reachable, not through ritual, not through gold, but through silence. They never carved names into stone. Their dead were wrapped in reeds, floated into the water, and allowed to drift toward the marshes where the crocodiles would not go and the birds circled without sound. They believed the river could carry a soul across without words, without ceremony, that it could remember for you if you were willing to forget yourself. At first the other settlements mocked them, called them cursed, but when a plague swept through the eastern delta, wiping out 3 towns in as many weeks, this village was untouched. The priests took notice. Then, shortly after, one of the high stewards from Memphis vanished, last seen boarding a ferry heading north. Days later, a merchant claimed to have spotted him, barefoot and smiling, walking along the banks at the forgotten bend. But when soldiers were sent, they found nothing, no village, no huts, only a scattering of reed boats tied in the shallows and the faint smell of myrrh on the air. The story might have ended there, if not for a young scribe named Keitamu. He was not important, not wealthy, the son of a brickmaker and a mother who spun flax, but he had the kind of mind that noticed patterns others ignored. He was 27 when he came across a half-burned scroll in a temple archive. It contained a passage from a funerary text that didn't match the usual style. No mention of the gods, no prayers, only a single phrase written again and again in the margins. The river does not forget, the river does not speak, the river knows. He could have dismissed it. Many did, but something about it stayed with him. For weeks he began rising before dawn, walking to the docks of Memphis, listening to the bargemen, Most of what he heard was the usual noise: trading prices, gossip about priests, curses thrown at the wind. But every now and then, someone would lower their voice and mention a fog that had rolled up the Nile with no source, a stretch of river where birds flew high and never came low. A woman who had left one morning to fetch lotus and returned 3 days later, her hands coated in dark clay, her voice gone forever. Eventually, Keitamu went to the high lector priest and requested leave to travel south. He had no official reason, no sponsor, but perhaps the gods had their eye on him that day, or perhaps the priest was too tired to argue. A week later, Keitamu boarded a merchant barge and began his journey upstream. For 4 days, the Nile was ordinary. Blue skies, papyrus rafts, the smell of fish oil and goat sweat. But on the 5th morning, he awoke early, long before the crew stirred. The light outside was pale, the water was glass still, and on the eastern bank, barely visible between the reeds, stood a child. The barge drifted past without slowing. The child did not move, did not wave. But Keitamu felt a jolt inside his ribs, like a word spoken without breath. By midday, the river had narrowed. The wind died. The crew grew quiet without noticing, and then, without any sign or warning, the bend appeared. There was no village, no houses, just a broad curve in the river where the light seemed dimmer, and the surface of the water rippled with no wind. The air was warm, but Keitamu shivered. He asked the boatman to stop. The man frowned, looked toward the reeds, then muttered something under his breath and dropped anchor. Keitamu stepped onto the muddy shore and listened. There was no sound, not of birds, not of insects, just the steady breath of the river. He walked inland through the brush and found nothing. No ruins, no shrines, but there were paths too straight to be natural, too smooth to be wild. They led in loops, as if guiding him without direction. After a time, he sat beside a pool, where the water was clear and cold. He reached in to cup some in his hand, and saw that the reflection looking back was not his. The face was older, lined, its eyes were closed. When he blinked, it vanished. He returned to the boat in silence. The crew did not speak as he climbed aboard. They cast off. The wind returned. He said nothing of what he'd seen. But when he returned to Memphis, he no longer wrote, no longer carved names in clay. He began collecting jars, small simple vessels made of unpainted stone. Into each he would whisper a word, just one, then seal them with wax, and place them in the river. Some say those jars still drift, others say they sank, each carrying a piece of a name that had been forgotten, not by accident, but by choice. And still the river flows, quiet, endless. It does not forget, but it never tells. The clay faces of men. In the hills beyond the Third Cataract, far from the reach of most priests and governors, there once stood a low-walled settlement, known only by those who needed to find it. No official name marked it on scrolls. No seal carried its identity. But travelers, those who wandered too long or listened too well, spoke of a place where people wore more than one face. Not masks, not disguises, faces. They were made of clay, fine river clay, pulled from the slowest moving water, mixed with ash and ground limestone, then shaped carefully, each crease pressed by hand. These weren't the painted festival masks worn in Memphis, or the hollow death masks set over mummies. These faces were smaller, finer, made to fit in the palm or sit gently over the brow, thin as a sheet of bark. But more than that, they were believed to hold the memory of the self. It began, they said, with the potters, not artisans, not common craftsmen, but something older, people who claimed descent from the first ones to shape form from mud, before speech, before symbols. They lived at the edges of the kingdom, neither honored nor hunted, and spent their lives making faces for others, quietly, anonymously. Each face bore no name, yet each was meant for someone, and when worn, they brought clarity, not transformation, exactly, something quieter, a way of setting aside oneself to become another for a while. The practice was not illegal, nor was it spoken of. Pharaohs knew of it. Some even kept a face hidden in their tomb, one not meant to be seen, used only in dreams. One such face was discovered during a flood year, when the banks of a tributary swallowed part of an old granary. Workers clearing the debris found a bundle of cloth wrapped in reeds, sealed in pitch. Inside was a face, deep brown clay with a faint sheen, lips parted slightly, no decoration, just simple humanity, captured in earth. When the overseer held it in his hands, he said he felt as though someone was watching him, not with anger, with recognition. The mask was taken to a priest. The priest said nothing, only touched the surface, and then ordered it to be buried again. deeper this time, beyond the reach of water. But word of it spread, as such things do, and soon people began to seek out the facemakers. A man who had lost a son came asking for a face of grief, not his own grief, but the kind of grief he thought he should feel. A merchant who feared judgment asked for a face that could forget. A woman nearing death asked for a face that remembered only the moments when she was most alive. The potters did not ask questions, they only listened, measured the breath, the way the person blinked, the way their voice curved at the end of a sentence. Then they would sit by the kiln and shape what was needed. Each face took 3 days to form. It had to dry in silence. It had to be burned under a moonless sky. When finished, the wearer would press it gently to their own, and breathe out, once, deeply. The clay would warm, soften just enough, and settle like memory into skin. Most only wore the face once, but some forgot to take it off. There was a story of a scribe who wore the face of his own father. He had done it out of guilt, thinking perhaps he would understand him better. He walked differently, sat with his back straighter, began speaking with words his own mouth had never used before. At first it felt like closeness, then something changed. He stopped answering to his own name. When colleagues questioned him, he smiled and said they were mistaken, that he had always been who he was. Eventually, he disappeared. The face was later found on the steps of a temple in Thebes, wrapped in linen, marked only with a single glyph, return. There were other stories, of course, of lovers who shared faces, of priests who wore the expressions of gods, of a soldier who wore the face of peace into battle, and dropped his spear before the first blow fell. Not all tales ended in sorrow. One scroll fragment, found in the ruins of an old granary, described a woman who wore the face of her younger self as she prepared for death, not out of vanity, but remembrance. When she died, her face was still smiling, not the thin, rehearsed smile of the court, but the wide, bright grin of a girl chasing birds across the floodplain. The potters never explained how the faces worked. Some said the clay held breath the way papyrus held ink. Others believed the wearers were not changed but revealed. And then there were those who whispered a third possibility, that the faces remembered something older than the wearer, that when pressed to the skin, they whispered back. And if you listened too long, you might begin to answer. In time, the practice faded. The kilns grew cold. The potters returned to dust. But every now and then, in a tomb far from the great cities, someone finds a mask with no decoration, no name, just a face, simple and watching. They say if you hold it long enough, you'll feel warmth, as if it's remembering you, even if you've forgotten yourself. The weaver's last pattern. There was once a weaver who lived in the shadow of the temple walls, her small home tucked so closely to the rear foundations that the chants of the priests echoed through her walls at every hour. She was not of the temple, not part of the rituals or the trained staff who prepared incense and oils, but she was permitted to live there because of her craft. The cloth she made was unlike any found in the markets. Her fingers moved without hesitation. Her threads rarely snapped, and even the pickiest priests admitted that her linen robes carried something extra, something not taught. They called her Mehnet, though no one knew if that was her true name or simply the name given to her trade. She had been there since before the high priest was appointed, before the last rebuilding of the southern pylons, before the courtyard fig tree had borne fruit, and she wove without fail, dawn to dusk, pausing only for water and the smallest bowl of lentils and bread. Her home smelled of fibre and myrrh, of warm stone and slow patience. Her loom stood in the center of the single room, so large that she had to duck under its frame to reach her mat each night. She never moved it, even when the seasons shifted and the rains came sideways, even when the walls cracked and a mason offered to help her shift it. She only smiled and said, "If it moves, the pattern breaks." Most never saw the full cloths she produced. They vanished into temple stores, wrapped around statues, sewn into funeral shrouds, or cut into strips to wrap sacred items that no one touched again. But once, during a festival for Hathor, a portion of her weaving was carried through the street as part of the great procession. Those who saw it said it shimmered, not like gold, but like heat on stone, like memory. No one knew how old Mehnet was. Her face was lined like river bark, but her hands never trembled. Her eyes, pale from years of staring into thread, still followed every movement around her with quiet precision. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was always in the language of her craft. She didn't say things plainly, she described them in warp and weft, in the tension between threads, in the knots that held the world together. But the day came, as it must, when she stopped weaving. No one noticed at first. The loom still stood, Her doors still opened in the morning. But there was no sound from inside, no rhythm of shuttle and thread, no gentle click of bone comb against stretched linen. A curious novice from the temple brought her a dish of figs and asked if she was unwell. Mehmet only smiled and said, "It is time to begin the last pattern." No one understood what she meant, but they left her alone, as they always had. That night, she began to unravel, not herself, but her work. Thread by thread, she reached up and began to undo her longest weaving. The cloth that had hung across the back beam of the loom for decades, grown thick with dust and shadow. It had not been touched since anyone could remember. Some thought it decorative, or simply forgotten. But she knew every thread. She pulled them slowly, winding them into small skeins, which she placed in a basket of dark wood. As she worked, she whispered, not prayers, but names. Not names of people, but of moments. She named each skein for a memory. The morning mist that smelled of figs, the crack in the temple floor shaped like a bird's wing, the time the sun passed behind a cloud and lit the edge of her cloth like gold. She wound until her hands bled. And when the last thread had been drawn out, she turned the loom. It had never faced the open doorway before. Now it looked straight into the dawn. Mehmet chose 6 threads, each a different shade, each from a different year, and tied them together with an invisible knot. This would be her final warp, her last framework. The base of the cloth that would not be seen by priests or gods or buried in a crypt, this one was for her. Each day she wove a little, just a few inches. She sang under her breath, low, steady, a sound that wavered between humming and breath. The cloth that formed was unlike any she had made. It bore no repeating design, no gods, no symbols, no protective sigils. It was a pattern of movement, a flowing, shifting, storm-like design that changed subtly as the light moved. On the 6th night, she sat before it in silence. The next morning, a novice knocked to bring her water. The door was ajar. The loom stood in place. The basket of skeins was empty. Mehmet was gone. No bed showed signs of sleep. No dishes bore traces of food. Only the loom remained, and the cloth still unfinished, but wide enough to catch the morning light. As the sun rose, it lit the fabric from behind, and for a moment something moved in it. Some shape, not seen but sensed. A face perhaps, a path, or just the gentle folding of the world into a pattern no one else could read. The priests searched, but no one found her. They sealed the house, but the loom was left untouched. Over the years, dust gathered, weeds crept in through the cracks, but the loom never collapsed. The cloth never faded, and those who peeked through the cracks on certain mornings swore the thread still shifted, just slightly, just enough, to suggest a pattern that continued on its own. A weaving that did not end, not because it was unfinished, but because it had always been the beginning. The crocodile's promise. It was said that not all temples in Egypt were built for worship. Some were built for containment. Far beyond the clustered cities, past the line where date palms ended and only cracked earth remained, stood a shrine with no name carved above its gate. It was low and wide, half sunken into the riverbank, where the Nile curled like a black ribbon. The locals called it simply, the place of the mouth. Children were warned not to speak its name aloud. Even the fishermen rowed wide around the bend, where its stone roof jutted like a broken tooth. There were stories, of course. Every village had one. Some said it had been a place of judgment in the early dynasties, where only the most dangerous souls were weighed. Others claimed it was built by priests who had lost their way, casting spells without end, and unleashing things that crawled in silence through the sand. But the oldest stories told of a pact, a promise made not with gods, but with something older. The crocodiles in that part of the Nile never left the water, not even at night. They lingered with slow eyes and still jaws, as if waiting for something. They were larger than the ones downstream, quiet, observant. They were not hunted, not even by the boldest youths. Inside the shrine, time had folded in on itself. The halls were crooked, the floors uneven, and the scent of the air was not of dust, but of deep water. The walls were carved with scenes no longer taught, priests kneeling before monstrous forms, offerings of teeth and ropes, processions that ended in silence. Symbols of Sobek, the crocodile god, were scratched over again and again, not in reverence, but in warning. And in the center of the lowest chamber, there was a pool. It was not a pool that reflected. Its surface did not show your face, it absorbed. Looking into it felt like remembering something that had never happened. Cold reeds brushing your legs, breath catching in your chest, the slow approach of something massive beneath you. Yet the water did not ripple. According to a forgotten scroll sealed within the archives of Kom Ombo, a young prince once came to this place before he was crowned. His name is lost now, intentionally erased, but he had been troubled since childhood. He dreamed of things he could not explain, great jaws breaking through the floor, eyes in the reeds, hands that did not belong to the living. He believed he had been cursed, but an elder scribe, one who wore no title and lived beyond the temple's reach, told him it was not a curse, it was a promise. A promise made before birth, a bond with the old god. A soul meant not to rule, but to remember. The prince, desperate for clarity, made the journey alone. He left his guards at the river's bend and stepped into the shrine just before the moon reached its highest point. What he saw inside was never written, but the scribe who received him after swore his eyes had changed, not their color, but their direction. He no longer looked at people, he looked through them. From that day he spoke more slowly. He never smiled again. But his reign was peaceful, strangely so. Crops never failed. Floods always came when needed, and in his 21st year, a procession of crocodiles was seen swimming upstream in a perfect line, passing the palace steps without a sound. The prince disappeared that night. The only sign left behind was his headdress, found floating gently in a pool of water where no water had been before. His name was struck from the walls. No statue remains, and yet when the Nile runs high and the waters swallow the roots of the papyrus groves, old fishermen sometimes say they see a figure walking the edges, not a beast. A man, cloaked in linen, barefoot, eyes deep as river stone, watching and listening. The shrine still stands, half buried now, its entrance smothered by reeds and years. But on the hottest nights, when the moon turns dull and orange, the crocodiles gather once more at that curve in the river. Not hunting, not resting, waiting, because promises made before the first dynasty were never meant to be broken, and some thrones, though empty, are never unclaimed. The Keeper of the Red Vault. In the far reaches of Upper Egypt, where the Nile bent like a sleeping serpent and the cliffs rose high and sun bleached against the sky, there was a temple unlike the others. Travelers rarely spoke of it, not because it was forbidden, many places in Egypt were, but because it simply never came up. Its name was never carved on walls. It was never mentioned in festival songs. It existed in the hush between places, hidden behind a long ridge of rock that looked, from a distance, like the spine of some buried creature, and nestled into its hollow was what the scribes called Per Deseret, the Red Vault. The Red Vault was not a temple of worship, nor a tomb in the usual sense. It was a library of sorts, but not one filled with scrolls. Its walls were carved deep with spells and records, names and dates, but none were meant for reading in the light. The carvings were etched into the stone so faintly that they could only be read in low torchlight, when shadows made the letters move. The walls were alive with memory too dangerous to walk in the open. It was built centuries before even the Old Kingdom, in the reign of a ruler whose name had been removed from all records. They called him the Nameless Pharaoh, and it was said that he had feared not war, nor death, nor foreign gods, but forgetting. His obsession with remembrance had driven him to madness. He ordered the construction of the vault in secret, using stone hauled from a red mountain that no other pharaoh dared quarry. He commanded his priests to write not only his deeds, but his thoughts, his dreams, his doubts, and when it was done he sealed it and left no tomb of his own, choosing to be buried not in a pyramid, but beneath the vault itself. Thousands of years later, when most names had faded from the world, a single priest remained who knew the hidden paths to the place. He was not called by title. No one bowed when he passed. He wore no gold, no amulet, just plain linen, and sandals worn smooth by sand. He had no family, no apprentices, only a long curved staff that clicked softly against the stone as he walked. They called him the Keeper. The Keeper did not leave the desert. He lived alone in a small chamber carved just outside the vault's entrance, with a single oil lamp and a basin of cool water drawn from a narrow underground spring. He rose with the stars and slept at midday, keeping time by the tilt of constellations instead of clocks, and once each week he entered the vault to brush away the dust and speak the names carved on the walls, names that had not been spoken aloud in 3,000 years. His voice was soft but steady. He knew the order of the names by heart, could find the inscriptions even in total darkness. Some names belonged to kings, others to traitors, some to souls who had never been born but had been dreamt into being by scribes seeking to balance out forgotten generations. The Keeper whispered each one, not as prayer, but as remembrance. It was said that as long as he spoke them, the souls behind them would never fully cross. One night the Keeper noticed something strange. a thin line of soot above the threshold stone, where no fire had been. He stepped inside the vault and saw that one of the inscriptions, the name of a queen from the 8th dynasty, had been scraped away. Not by time, by a blade. Someone had entered. He left no alarm, no message. The next day he followed the ancient river path upstream, in search of a single person who might help him understand. A woman who called herself the Dyer's daughter, who lived among ruins far beyond Thebes, and whose hands bore stains that no lie could wash clean. She was not a priestess, nor a scribe, but she knew of inks that glowed in darkness, and dyes that revealed what stone tried to hide. The keeper trusted her. When he returned with her to the vault, she knelt beside the defaced wall and lit a thin blue flame beneath a shard of copper. The name that had been scraped away began to shimmer faintly as though its outline still lingered in memory, but beside it, something new had been carved. A single glyph, so crude it looked as though it had been chiseled by shaking hands. The glyph meant unbound. The keeper sat in silence for a long time. The dyer's daughter did not ask what it meant. She only stared at the flame, waiting. Finally the keeper stood and opened a hidden recess behind the main chamber, a place even he had rarely entered. It was filled with boxes made of black wood, bound in cords of gold wire. Each held a tablet, wrapped in linen. These were the last records of the nameless pharaoh, written in the lost tongue, translated only once and never aloud. He selected the one marked with a symbol like a closed eye, and placed it gently on the table. As the dyer's daughter unwrapped it, a draught stirred the torch flame, though no wind had entered. The room seemed to breathe. The tablet's surface was rough, like skin, but the writing was smooth and cold. It spoke of a gate, neither in the sky nor in the duat, but beneath memory itself, a place where the forgotten gathered, not the evil, not the damned, simply the lost, those whose names had faded too soon, or were erased by jealous kings, or miswritten by clumsy scribes. Their souls, unable to return to the world, had begun to pull at the weave of time. The glyph unbound was their mark. It meant that a memory had broken free, and when enough did, the boundary between past and present would fray, and the vault would no longer be a prison. It would become a gate. The keeper sealed the tablet again, and turned to the dyer's daughter. They both understood what had to be done. For the first time in many lifetimes, the vault would have to be rewritten, not to remember, but to release. A ritual uncarving, a right to return the forgotten to silence, not out of cruelty, but out of peace. For the next 9 nights they worked by torchlight, humming a melody that had no words, each note passed down by those who served the vault centuries before, and as the 10th night fell, they opened the deepest chamber of the red vault and placed the last of the uncarved stones there. No name, no mark, only stillness. When they left, the wind picked up over the cliffs, and the ridge of rock looked once more like the spine of something ancient, now asleep again beneath the sand. And the keeper, now older than ever, returned to his room with the basin of water, and waited for sleep. He no longer needed to whisper names. The vault was at rest, and so, at last, was he. There was once a room beneath the old city of Wassat, what the Greeks would one day call Thebes. But this room did not appear on any map, nor was it carved with offerings or prayers. It had no pillars, no statues of gods, no door to mark its threshold. Only a narrow corridor, built with sloping angles and hidden seams, led to it, a corridor known only to a single bloodline of priests, and to the pharaohs who feared what their dreams foretold. They called it the Hall Without Echoes. To enter was to be alone with yourself, utterly and inescapably. No torchlight dared to flicker in its corners. Sound fell flat against the walls, as if swallowed by stone, and no voice, not even a shout, would return to its speaker. It was not a place for ceremony, it was a place for reckoning. Most pharaohs never saw it, only those who heard the whispers at the edge of dreams, who felt the judgment of the gods before death had even drawn near, the ones whose hearts beat too loudly when passing the tombs of their ancestors, the ones who saw shadows on the backs of scrolls where no ink had been laid. The Hall Without Echoes was their mirror. It was said the chamber was older than the city itself, built before language, before the rites of Maat had shaped the land. Some claimed it was a shard of the underworld that had risen by mistake, a piece of the Duat, never meant to be touched by light. Others believed it had been carved in silence by the first priests of the first sun, their tools made not from bronze or obsidian, but from stillness and time. There were no records of what occurred inside, no scribes followed, no guards were allowed. The pharaoh entered alone, and emerged, if they emerged at all, changed. One tale, passed only in the margins of forbidden texts, told of a queen who ruled in the time before the pyramids. Her name had been bright and long, scattered across temples and grain silos, etched into the handles of makeup jars, and inked onto amulets worn by children. But as the years grew heavy, she began to lose her sleep to the sound of dripping water, except there was no water. It came from within her ears, at first, then in the footsteps of her servants, in the rustle of papyrus scrolls, in the tapping of her own nails against the ivory arm of her throne, a steady, patient dripping. When she ordered her priests to explain it, they said nothing. But an elder woman from the old districts, a weaver with hands like driftwood, and eyes that saw too far, whispered only one word, the hall. So the queen went. Her procession was grand, as all royal movements were, but she sent them away before reaching the entrance. Only she walked the corridor, and only she knew what waited in that chamber. When she returned, it was near dawn. Her headdress was gone, her sandals were gone, her eyes, those sharp ruling eyes, were wide with something no one could name. She ruled for 10 more years after that day, wisely, gently, and before her death, she gave orders for her cartouche to be removed from all walls. Not erased, she said, but unremembered. And then she was gone. In the centuries that followed, others would seek the hall in secret. Some went mad, some were never seen again. A few emerged in silence, more empty than before, but strangely at peace. It became understood, not officially, but deeply, quietly, that the hall without echoes was not a punishment. It was a choice, for those willing to meet the shape of their soul before the gods ever called it forth. No offerings were ever left in that place, nothing living would grow there. And yet, on the coldest nights of the calendar, when the stars gather thick above the ruins of Thebes, priests in white still pause when walking the sacred avenues. They stop, they listen, and sometimes, just barely, they hear footsteps, slow and steady from beneath the ground, not coming, returning, from the silence that has no end. The flooded temple. There is a place far south of the cataracts, where the Nile no longer flows in neat obedient curves, but spills over stone and canyon, pulled by currents that seem older than the river itself. The banks here are steep, carved with time, and the water sometimes laps at things half buried in silt and forgotten reeds, fragments of pillars, corners of statues, the curved spine of an ark long since surrendered to the mud. No path leads here, no map records its shape, but the fishermen of the southernmost villages know to avoid it. They call it the Drowned Bend, and when they pass near, they do not speak aloud, because beneath the water, just barely visible when the light is right and the river is still, lies a temple. Its roof is gone, and most of its columns have fallen inward, like the ribs of a broken beast, but something of it remains, a doorway, arched and precise, framed by fluted stone that resists the currents like the bones of a god. Through that doorway, hidden beneath 3 fathoms of shadowed water, is a chamber sealed not by brick, but by ritual. The temple has no known name, but in the oldest scrolls stored in the libraries of Memphis, it is called the Womb of Nepa-Ka. It was not built to honor a god, but to contain a memory. Long ago, during the reign of the dynasty, whose name was later struck from the record, the kingdom suffered a season of deaths that did not end with the rising sun. Crops withered before harvest, children were born without breath. The priests said the balance between Maat and Isfet had tipped, order had cracked, and chaos had begun to whisper through the cracks. And so, in desperation, a temple was built. But unlike other temples, this one was not carved from plans sent by stargazers or scribes. It was shaped by dreams, or rather one dream, shared by many, over the course of a single sleepless week. All who had the dream described the same thing, a temple beneath the river, its halls lit by cold fire, its walls carved with stories no voice dared tell, and at its center, a cradle of black stone holding a single scroll, wrapped in silver thread. The dream ended the same way for everyone, with a voice, gentle and hollow, saying, "Return what was stolen." So they built it, exactly as seen, and they placed inside it the scroll written in that same dream, a scroll whose text was never transcribed, never copied. It was said that even to read the first line aloud was to invite unraveling. Only one person was allowed to carry it, the priestess of Nepa-Ka. Her name was Nefret. She had no family, no origin anyone could trace. She had appeared in Thebes on the day of the second red sunrise, walking barefoot across stone, eyes lined with black ash, speaking a tongue no one had heard, and yet all understood. The high priests recognized her not by lineage or test, but by silence. In her presence, Even the wind seemed to pause. Nefret entered the temple on the night of the third eclipse. No one followed her. The doors were sealed behind her with wax from a black hive, and the water was allowed to rise. That was 200 years before the fall of the dynasty. Now, in the present, the temple remains mostly hidden. But the scroll, it still exists. It was never removed, only guarded, and now it stirs. It begins with a tremor, not in the earth, but in the dreamscape. One night, a boy in a nearby village awakens, soaked in sweat, mumbling of a woman in a temple who holds a scroll of silver thread. The next night, a fisherman hears a voice while anchored by the bend, telling him, in a tongue not spoken in generations, that the balance is tipping once more. The priest of the village shrine sends word northward, across trade routes and temples, until it reaches an old scribe in Memphis, a woman called Hinatui, whose scroll room is filled with texts so rare they no longer appear in the catalogues. She reads the message once and closes her eyes. She has heard of the womb of Nepa-Ka. More importantly, she has seen its dream. Hinatui gathers her satchel, inks and 2 amulets carved from jet, and begins her journey south. Her feet are steady, her mind quieter than it has been in years. She follows no map, only the rhythm of the Nile. And when she reaches the drowned bend, she finds it just as described, still watchful, quiet. She camps at its edge and waits. That night, she dreams. She sees the temple whole again, the roof intact, the columns upright. Inside, the water does not move. It glows faintly blue, and Nefret stands in the center, eyes open, hands cradling the scroll. The dream shifts. The voice speaks. The memory is breaking. Return what was stolen. When Hinatui wakes, the river is lower, just enough. She walks barefoot into the water, slow and careful, until the doorway is visible. There is no lock, no threshold, just a sense of crossing. Inside, the temple is colder. Though the sun blazes above, the water feels like night. She moves with care, eyes open, hands out. The walls still bear the carvings, stories of days that never were, futures unchosen, pasts too heavy to carry. In the heart of the temple, she finds it, the cradle of stone, and there, untouched by silt or time, the scroll wrapped in silver thread. She does not read it, she only listens, and in that silence, the message is clear. The scroll must not be taken, not again. It is not a warning, it is an anchor, a record of what must not happen. Hinatui reaches into her satchel, and pulls free a shard of obsidian etched with new glyphs, marks only the keeper of the red vault would recognize. A rite, not to erase, but to reinforce. She places it beside the scroll and bows her head. As she rises, the water begins to move again, gently now, like a sigh. She leaves the temple without looking back. By dawn, the river has risen once more, and the doorway disappears beneath the surface. In the villages nearby, the dreams cease, the balance quiets, and far away in Memphis, in the deepest chamber of the scroll room, a candle flickers behind sealed glass, though no hand lit it, and so the flooded temple sleeps again, until memory stirs. The Keeper of Dust. In the farthest reaches of Egypt's desert borderlands, beyond the places where papyrus grows, beyond the reach of the camel herders, beyond even the stories passed from mother to child, there lies a region known in the oldest texts simply as the Hollow Quarter. It is not marked on any map, and no caravan passes through it. Those who wander too close speak of winds that moan without pause, and dunes that move as though alive. Even the stars above seem to flicker differently here, more scattered, less fixed, as if memory itself weakens beneath the sand. It is here, half buried beneath a crescent-shaped ridge of white limestone, that the chamber was built, not above the ground, nor beneath it, but inside it. The walls of the chamber are not stone, but packed dust, compressed over generations until it hardened like resin. No entrance is visible from above, no stairs descend. The only way to find the place is to be called, and that calling comes not by voice, but by forgetting. It begins with dreams that vanish as soon as they are dreamt, then with names of old friends, of gods, of oneself. Eventually, even time slips, until the morning no longer follows the night, and the weight of a day can no longer be measured. That is when the keeper appears, never before, never sooner. He does not walk, but arrives. He wears a robe that seems made of sand itself, shifting slightly with every movement. His face is covered, not by a mask, but by layers of linen soaked in resin and crushed myrrh, wrapped again and again until no skin remains visible. Only his eyes are bare, and they do not blink. The keeper does not speak, he waits. And if the one who has been called still remembers why they came, if even a shred of purpose remains, he gestures, slowly toward the crest of the dune. And there, just beneath the surface, the dust parts. The chamber is dry, impossibly so. Every grain of sand that rests within has not touched open air in over 1,000 years. The walls are carved in low relief, not of kings or gods, but of places, cities lost long before the pyramids, rivers that never fed the Nile, trees with fruit shaped like stars, and at the center of the chamber is the archive. Not scrolls, not tablets, not even papyrus. The archive is made of memory, memories bound in clay vessels, sealed with tar, each inscribed with only a single name, names that have been forgotten by the world, but not erased. These are not the famous ones, not the names of kings or generals or queens. They are the names of those who carried burdens quietly. A washerwoman who buried her brother during the Second Plague, a soldier who left a gift at a shrine and never returned, a scribe who chose not to write a lie. Each vessel contains the truth of a soul, not judged, not weighed, simply held. The keeper's task is not to remember, it is to hold space for remembering. Every century, a new vessel is added, no more, and in this century, the vessel belongs to someone different, a high priest, once keeper of the southern temples, who abandoned his title, his robes, and his voice. He wandered into the desert on the eve of the spring flood, and was thought lost, but he knew where he was going. The dream had come to him 3 nights in a row, whispering in the ancient tongue of the sky people, the language that predates even the gods of Heliopolis. In his hand, he carried nothing, but in his heart, he carried the name of someone the temples had chosen to forget. Her name was Senera. She was never given a title, though her wisdom ran deeper than the sacred lake. She had healed without ritual, prophesied without incense, and once stood beside the body of a dying prince and told him the truth, that the next world would not know his crown. For this, she was struck from the records, but her name lived on, not in ink, but in breath, and the priest, who had once condemned her in silence, now came to remember her aloud. The keeper did not stop him. Instead, he lifted one hand and pointed to an empty vessel resting on a platform of glassy black stone. The priest knelt beside it, spoke her name once, and pressed both palms to the clay. A low hum filled the chamber, not sound, but a kind of memory taking root. When the priest stood again, the vessel glowed faintly, its surface etched itself with a new glyph, invisible to the eye, but present in the soul. The keeper reached forward, sealed it with tar, and turned his head slightly toward the wall of older vessels. There, on a high shelf, one flickered and vanished. A trade had been made. Each vessel can only rest here for so long. When one is remembered anew in the world of the living, its memory is no longer needed here. And so, Senera's memory entered the archive, and the soul of a potter named Menes, long held in sleep, returned to the cycle of time. Outside, the desert wind quieted. The priest did not speak again. He bowed once, and made his way back over the ridge. The keeper watched until the figure vanished. Then he turned, crossed the floor of the chamber, and sat beside the archive. There, surrounded by vessels filled not with words, but with the weight of unspoken lives, he closed his eyes. In the hollow quarter, the dust shifted, and the world, for one more night, remained whole. The temple that sleeps. In the western desert, where the stone hills rise like frozen waves from an ancient, dried-out sea, there lies a place few have seen, and fewer still remember. The mapmakers do not mark it. Caravan routes curve wide around its edges. Even the winds, it seems, avoid the low cleft of rock where the temple stands, half buried, half forgotten, wholly still. To approach it is to feel a hush grow inside you, not one of fear but of stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The entrance reveals itself only at dusk. When the sun strikes the cliff at just the right angle, a long diagonal shadow is cast across the sand, pointing to a narrow seam between 2 outcrops. It looks like nothing more than a natural split in the rock, but to those who have heard the stories, who have listened to the oldest desert folk speak in whispers around firelit tents, it is a passage, a gateway, a wound in the earth, cut so long ago that even the stones around it have forgotten how to bleed. Inside, the air changes immediately. It is cooler, but not with the usual relief of shade. It feels deeper, denser, the kind of coolness that sinks into your chest and settles behind your ribs. The walls of the passage are smooth, carved long ago with tools no longer known, and although they are unmarked by time or sand, they bear no writing, no symbols, no divine names, only the smoothness of work done carefully by hands that were not quite human. The corridor descends slowly, not in steep steps but in a gentle spiral. as if trying not to disturb something sleeping below. There are no torches, no oil bowls, but the stone glows faintly with a strange luminescence, not bright enough to see clearly, just enough to know you are not alone. The light comes from nowhere. It seems to live in the walls themselves, pulsing softly like the breath of a sleeper. At the bottom of the slope, the corridor opens into a wide antechamber. It is circular, built with perfect geometry, though the ceiling is lost in shadow. Pillars rise around the room, carved to resemble tall, robed figures, all faceless. Their hands are crossed in front of them, not in the gesture of kings or scribes or priests, but in a posture of waiting, of rest. They face inward, toward the center of the room, where a still, black pool stretches in perfect silence. This is the heart of the temple, the pool of the dreaming sky. Its surface reflects nothing, not the ceiling, not your face, not the columns behind you. And yet, if you stare long enough, you begin to see movement, faint and slow, like clouds drifting across a distant night. The pool does not show this world, it remembers another. A place with no sun and no sand, where stars move in different patterns and the air hums with an ancient voiceless melody. No offerings lie beside the pool, no incense bowls or jars of oil. This is not a place where the living come to worship, nor a place where gods demand tribute. It is something else entirely. The villagers call it the sleeping house. The priests long ago gave it no name, for what sleeps here is older than temples, older than gods, older than the spoken word. Some say this temple was not built, but grown, called forth from the stone by sound and will, and something older than prayer. Others say it was left behind by those who ruled before the sky had a name, a shelter for spirits too powerful to pass, and too weary to remain awake. The few scrolls that mention it do so only in fragments. The breath of silence, one fragment reads, dwells in the hollow beyond the west. Another calls it the chamber beneath memory, and those who return, if they speak at all, say the same thing, that time moves differently inside, that dreams feel heavier there, that if you sit by the pool long enough, it begins to dream you. There was a man once, a stonecutter from Wassat, who followed a vision into the cliffs. His name was carved on a stele near the riverbank, though the carving is worn now, and the rid boat that once ferried him has long since rotted to dust. He entered the temple one morning, alone, with nothing but a lamp and a jar of water. He was not seen again for 7 days. When he returned, his hair had fallen out, and his eyes were bright with something no one could name. He walked to the river, washed his hands in silence, and spent the rest of his life painting scenes of stars no other Egyptian had ever seen, constellations that did not belong to any known sky. He never spoke of what he saw. Others came after him, a singer who had lost her voice, a general haunted by the faces of the men he had killed, a child who had dreamed of a door in the rock and followed the wind until it opened. Each of them entered the temple in silence. Each of them returned changed, quieter, not broken but distant, like they had found something deeper than sorrow and heavier than joy. It is said that the gods themselves once used this temple, in the time before memory, that when a god no longer wished to be remembered, no longer wished to be bound by prayers or names or offerings, they would walk into the temple and lie down beside the pool, and there in the hush of the stone and the breathless dark, they would sleep, not to die, but to forget. And in forgetting, they became part of the earth again, the desert wind, the whisper in the reeds, the silence between two thoughts. Some even say that every god who has vanished from the old stories, those whose names no longer appear in tombs or temple walls, lies beneath this very place, not dead, not banished, simply resting, wrapped in the dreams of a sky that no longer turns. And that is why the temple is never sealed. It needs no guards, no one stays long, not even the curious. There is something about the silence that seeps into you, something so vast and gentle and still that it invites you to let go, not in fear, not in surrender, but in understanding, that even the gods grow weary, that even the divine must sleep, and somewhere beneath that silent pool, beneath the faceless guardians and the glowing stone, a heartbeat echoes slowly, not loud, not urgent, just steady, as though something deep below is still dreaming, and does not wish to wake. The keeper of the breathless archive, far from the banks of the Nile, beyond the reach of barks and caravans, hidden in the cradle of 2 withered hills that never cast shadows, the same way twice, there is a narrow valley. It is not marked by monuments or guarded by jackals. Most who pass near it feel only a quiet unease, and choose to turn away without knowing why. But if you were to follow that instinct deeper, past the stone faces carved by wind and time, down into the basin where no birds sing and no trees grow, you would find, almost hidden by the curve of the land, a long, low structure, half swallowed by the sand. It is not a temple, nor is it a tomb. It bears no flags, no painted lintels or inscriptions at its gate. Its doorway is narrow and silent, flanked by two pillars so plain and worn that even the stone seems to have forgotten who placed them there. But the air around it is still, not lifeless, but patient, like breath held just beneath the surface. This is the archive without name, the breathless place. It is said that long ago, when the gods first began to withdraw from the affairs of men, they left behind fragments of themselves, echoes of divinity, sealed in words and gestures, scattered across Egypt, like sparks flung from a dying fire. Most were collected, some were forgotten, but a few were too dangerous to be buried, and too sacred to be destroyed. They were brought here. Inside, the halls are narrow, with ceilings so low that even a child must bow to pass. The walls are lined with clay jars, scroll tubes, and bundles of ancient reed parchment, each one wrapped in cloth or leather, each one marked only by a single glyph. The symbols are not familiar. They are not names or numbers. They are feelings, rendered in language older than writing. Longing, memory, silence, remorse. No fire burns here, no torchlight flickers. Instead, a soft phosphorescence clings to the ceiling, like dew on a cold morning, casting the shelves in a pale, unchanging glow. It does not warm, it does not flicker, it simply remains, quiet and watching. The archive is tended by a single figure. No one remembers his name. He does not write, he does not speak, he does not leave. Some say he was once a high lector priest, cast out for seeing something in the stars he was never meant to name. Others believe he was born in the archive itself, shaped by the echoes of what the jars contain. But those who've seen him, few as they are, agree on one thing. His eyes do not reflect light, they seem to drink it. And when he moves, the air around him seems to hesitate, like water touched by a passing oar. The keeper does not age, he simply waits. He walks the shelves, running his fingers lightly across the old jars, pausing now and then as if listening for a heartbeat trapped within the clay. And sometimes, only sometimes, he stops before a sealed bundle and carries it to a small stone table near the back of the chamber. There, he opens it, slowly, reverently, as if disturbing a sleeping spirit. The texts within the archive are not histories, they are not prayers, they are records of things that never should have been spoken. The true names of lost gods, maps of realms beneath the duat, spells to unbind a soul from its memory. One scroll is said to contain a single question, written so perfectly that reading it causes your own name to vanish from your mind. Another tells of a gate beneath the western desert that leads not to death, but to something after death. A second door, darker and older than anything Osiris ever ruled. There is a chamber near the back of the archive, beyond a curtain of dried lotus stalks that crackle like paper when touched. It holds no shelves, no jars, only a circle of obsidian stones set into the floor, with a single chair at the center carved from petrified wood. This is the listening room. Here the keeper sits when the winds above the valley change, when the breath of the world shifts direction. He places a scroll in his lap, not to read but to feel, to listen. For what is kept in the archive is not dead, it murmurs still, and on some nights, when the stars align behind a veil of drifting sand, the walls seem to sigh, the jars rattle faintly, and the keeper tilts his head, as if hearing a voice too distant to follow, yet too familiar to forget. He does not smile, he does not speak, but he remembers, not for himself, but for the world, because some memories must not be lost, even if they no longer have a place. The archive does not welcome visitors, but it does not turn them away. Those who find it are changed. Some arrive burdened with questions, dreams or half-remembered names that won't leave them. Some come seeking lost knowledge, desperate to undo a curse or speak with the dead. Some never come of their own will. They are led, by dreams, by signs, by the soft pull of something older than fate. They enter, they walk the shelves, and sometimes they find a jar with a glyph they recognize, not with their mind, but with something deeper, a trembling in their ribs, a memory they never made. If they open it, they do so alone, and when they leave, if they leave, they are never quite the same. The keeper watches, always. The archive is never full, never empty. It breathes, and beneath the surface of silence, it waits, because even in the age of fading gods and rising empires, even in the age of sand-choked temples and broken obelisks, there are things the world must remember, not in words, but in quiet, and in the quiet of the archive, the breath of the forgotten still lingers. The breath of stone. In the bowels of the great temple of Per, deep beneath the din of worshippers and the glow of countless oil lamps, there exists a chamber few enter, and fewer remember. This chamber lies out of time, concealed as much by memory as by stone. Generations of priests have passed over the spots of its entrances, worn by foot and habit, yet never truly knowing its location. The temple climbs above it in successive layers. First the courtyard, then the sanctuary, then the burial annex, but none mark the path down into silence' deepest fold. To sense its presence, one must feel for the cool breath that flows not outward but inward, as though the stones themselves inhale from the weight of ages. The corridor that leads to the chamber slopes gently, constructed of quarried limestone blocks so precisely fitted that no mortar remains, only the silent friction of ivory smooth edges. Oil lamps unlit by decree, but still glowing dimly as if lit by embers of memory, cast a muted rose light over the walls. Carved niches, empty now, once held statues of gods, but their forms have been removed, leaving only the negative space, a hollow hymn of absence. Dust motes drift like ghost ships through the lantern haze, and from somewhere deeper comes the faintest pulse of air, a place breathing slowly beneath the weight of centuries. The air changes the moment you step across the threshold. It feels alive. It isn't cold but dense, like moving water slowed by packaging, and it clings to your lungs in small, patient gulps. As you walk forward, reaching the heart of the space, you see it, a single statue seated upon a stone dais, formed from a rock so perfectly black it blends into the gloom. It is a figure impossible to name, faceless and silent, its head and shoulders chipped by none, carved with reverent precision, yet bearing no distinct features. Its arms rest calmly upon its lap, as if folded in endless waiting. Behind it, the walls curve into an arch that disappears into the gloom, an architectural cradle designed for stillness. The statue is silent, but it is not empty. Visitors often describe a change in the chamber's breath, as though the statue inhales and exhales, drawing the room around it into slow rhythm. A gentle sound builds, like the hush of desert wind pressed through stone reeds. It is never heard directly, caught only in the corners of awareness, yet it is a breath you can feel in your chest. Sometimes, on rare occasions, someone enters and reports that as they sat before the statue, their own heartbeat slowed until it seemed to match the chamber's inhales. There, they say, the stone speaks not with words but with memory, and memory is a voice older than sand. Despite the compelling gravity it exerts, the chamber remains undisturbed. No offerings lie at the feet of the statue, no scrolls are left at its base, no priests linger here after dusk. The corridors above resonate with drums, horns, chants, and incense, but beneath it all, this chamber remains hushed. Some believe that the silence is sacred, that speech, even prayers, would break the trance. Others think the chamber was meant to hold something absolute, the memory of silence itself. Legends say the statue was placed here long ago, during a time before Pur rose to prominence, a time when the gods were many, and the lines between mortal and divine were thin. An old priest whose name is lost to time claimed the statue fell from the sky, carried on a single bolt of lightning, and embedded itself into the stone. Others spoke of a king who, weary of war and wealth, meant only to ask for rest, and in response the silence answered. Those who have dared to visit often report similar phenomena. A stonecutter whose lungs had ceased to speak upon emerging. A temple scribe who, after spending a night in the chamber, no longer wrote in praise or curse, but only transcribed what he heard in the air, the sound of stones settling, of water forgotten, of secrets swallowed by the earth. Once an oracle entered, and stayed in silent vigil until her voice faded entirely. She left the temple speaking once more, but only to name the shapes of clouds. The statue is sometimes referred to as the listener, but its silence is not emptiness, it is memory incarnate. The walls seem to absorb beginnings of sentences and breathe them back without context. One monk who stayed for 3 days reported that when he tried to pray, he found himself repeating not his own words, but the pauses between them, the spaces where meaning might have been. Another visitor believed he heard laughter, soft and distant, as though the stones were amused by something just beyond reach. At the center of the chamber, beneath the statue's dais, lies a small stone altar of the same black rock, but atop it sits nothing, not incense, not offerings, only a thin film of dust that seems carefully preserved, never disturbed, never swept away. The priests above call it the dust of remembering. They say it is collected from the chamber's floor and returned each season, but this is disputed. Some believe the dust grows itself, slowly falling in countless infinitesimal particles from the statue's shoulders, as if it is shedding silence into the world. One night, a storm brought lightning overhead, striking the temple's highest pylon. The courtyard below shuddered with deafening cracks of thunder, but within the chamber, no sound was heard, not even the resonance of lightning through stone. Those above presumed the walls absorbed it. Others believed the statue had inhaled the storm, drawing its power into some unnameable reservoir. When the storm passed, the dust atop the altar remained untouched. In recent years, the current high priest has ordered the chamber sealed, locked from within. A bronze disc with a single glyph, shaped like a closed eye, was affixed to the doorway. But at dawn, someone unties the token and the disc is moved aside. No one sees how. No doors are broken. The glyph sometimes shifts. No two mornings display it the same. Some priests have taken to whispering the chamber's opening with prayers, but the chamber remains unchanged. The silence holds. It is said that those who linger too long before the statue awaken unready. They know things, half-remembered names, the exact shape of footsteps that never were taken, the tide patterns of rivers that no longer exist. They return to the world shadowed, as though they carried a second self folded inside them. None speak of the statue in detail, but each leaves a silent offering, a folded linen scrap, a small bowl left outside the corridor, an unlit lamp placed at the threshold. The chamber's breath continues, century after century. The temple above continues its rituals, but somewhere below, shaped by black stone and memory, time itself finds rest. And if you ever find yourself nearing the chamber's gate, take only one careful breath, step inside quietly, and feel the memory of silence as it was meant to be, unbroken. To the old jars, pausing now and then as if listening for a heartbeat trapped within the clay. And sometimes, only sometimes, he stops before a sealed bundle and carries it to a small stone table near the back of the chamber. There he opens it, slowly, reverently, as if disturbing a sleeping spirit. The texts within the archive are not histories, they are not prayers, they are records of things that never should have been spoken. The true names of lost gods, maps of realms beneath the Duat, spells to unbind a soul from its memory. One scroll is said to contain a single question, written so perfectly that reading it causes your own name to vanish from your mind. Another tells of a gate beneath the western desert, that leads not to death, but to something after death. A second door, darker and older than anything Osiris ever ruled. There is a chamber near the back of the archive, beyond a curtain of dried lotus stalks that crackle like paper when touched. It holds no shelves, no jars, only a circle of obsidian stones set into the floor with a single chair at the center carved from petrified wood. This is the listening room. Here, the keeper sits when the winds above the valley change, when the breath of the world shifts direction. He places a scroll in his lap, not to read, but to feel, to listen. For what is kept in the archive is not dead, it murmurs still, and on some nights, when the stars align behind a veil of drifting sand, the walls seem to sigh, the jars rattle faintly, and the keeper tilts his head, as if hearing a voice too distant to follow, yet too familiar to forget. He does not smile, he does not speak, but he remembers, not for himself, but for the world, because some memories must not be lost, even if they no longer have a place. The archive does not welcome visitors, but it does not turn them away. Those who find it are changed. Some arrive burdened with questions, dreams, or half-remembered names that won't leave them. Some come seeking lost knowledge, desperate to undo a curse, or speak with the dead. Some never come of their own will. They are led, by dreams, by signs, by the soft pull of something older than fate. They enter, they walk the shelves, and sometimes they find a jar with a glyph they recognize, not with their mind, but with something deeper, a trembling in their ribs, a memory they never made. If they open it, they do so alone, and when they leave, if they leave, they are never quite the same. The keeper watches, always. The archive is never full, never empty. It breathes, and beneath the surface of silence it waits. Because even in the age of fading gods and rising empires, even in the age of sand-choked temples and broken obelisks, there are things the world must remember, not in words, but in quiet. And in the quiet of the archive, the breath of the forgotten still lingers. The Garden of the Still Waters. It was said that beyond the reach of Cairo's riverbanks, farther even than the last cultivated fields before the desert claimed the land again, there once bloomed a garden with no season, a place where the sun never scorched, the winds never howled, and the sands around it held their breath. No map bore its mark, no papyrus named it, and yet every high priest, every scholar of the sacred, knew its story by heart. They called it Meru Hetep, the garden of still waters. The garden did not grow as other gardens did. It had no rows of beans or barley, no sycamore orchard, nor pomegranate tree. Instead, it lived as a reflection, an echo of creation itself, seeded not in soil but in memory, irrigated not by the Nile, but by the water the gods had forgotten. It was said that the first gardener had not been a man at all, but something older, a being that once walked among the stars before turning its back on the heavens to kneel in the dust. The entrance was found not through gates, but through stillness. Somewhere in the desert's endless folds, travelers would stop to rest beneath the shape of a crescent dune, and if they lingered long enough, they might begin to notice something strange. The wind would fall away, the heat would soften, a hush would settle into their bones, and then, quite without knowing how, they would see it, a wall of reeds, where there had been none before, rising straight from the sand, green as emerald, and swaying in a rhythm that did not match the world around them. If they passed between the reeds, they would emerge into a silence deeper than thought. Pools stretched out like mirrors, flat and unbroken. Lilies floated in rows so precise they could not have been placed by hand. The air smelled faintly of myrrh, not fresh, but old, like a forgotten blessing sealed in a jar. Trees arched overhead, not casting shadows but holding the light at bay. Their branches bore no fruit, only leaves that shimmered with a kind of golden sleep. No insects stirred, no birds cried overhead, only the soft rhythm of water breathing, as if the earth beneath the sand had a pulse of its own. The priests believed this was not a garden for the body, but for the ka, the spirit that lingered after breath. Those who wandered into it by chance were rare, but those who were led there were rarer still. When a high priest neared the end of his life, he would often speak in riddles, describing places no one else had seen. The pool without ripples, one would say. The tree that hums in silence, said another. And always they would add one final line. I hear her voice again. Who she was, none could say with certainty. But in temple lore, the garden of still waters was tended by a woman whose name had been erased. Not lost, but removed. An act of deliberate forgetting. She was not a goddess, yet no one dared call her mortal. It was said she once sat at the side of the first pharaoh, not as queen or servant, but as the one who whispered when he slept. When he died, she did not weep. She walked into the sand and disappeared, leaving behind no tomb, no scarab, no cartouche, only stillness. Now, in the garden, she tends the silence. Some say she walks barefoot across the waters, never disturbing the lilies. Others claim she wears robes made of papyrus strands, inked with the dreams of kings. But all who speak of her agree on one thing. She carries no tools. She does not prune the trees or scoop the water, or gather the leaves. She simply waits, and somehow, everything grows. One tale tells of a scribe who entered the garden in his sleep. He had grown old, his hands too stiff for ink, his memory soft around the edges. But in his dreams, he felt the warm hush of that hidden place. He saw her by the edge of the pool, kneeling, her fingers brushing the surface without rippling it. She did not look up, she did not speak, but when he woke, he found his scroll filled with a new language, one he could not read, but which made him weep to see. The garden, some say, exists between the waking world and the Duat, the land of the dead. Not a place of judgment, like the Hall of Two Truths, nor a land of torment, like the burning fields beyond the gates. It is the pause between breaths, the space between heartbeats, where the car waits not to be measured, but to be remembered. And so the water remains still, not because it is lifeless, but because nothing here must prove its place. There is a story, older than even the pyramids, of a child pharaoh who disappeared. His name had just begun to be carved into the temple walls when he vanished one night, without a trace. Searchers scoured the river, the dunes, even the tombs still being built for him, but nothing was found. Decades passed. The priests declared him reborn in another form. His name faded. But then, many lifetimes later, a traveler claimed to have seen a young boy seated at the edge of the garden of still waters, his feet in the pool, his face turned toward the light. He did not move, but when the traveler turned away and looked back, the boy was gone, and in his place sat a statue of lapis, untouched by time. To find the garden again, they say, one must walk not forward, but inward, past memory, past desire, through the voice that calls you in your own dreams, not in words, but in a feeling you've never known how to name. The path cannot be followed with feet, only with stillness. And if you come to the reeds, if the air begins to hum, and the wind forgets your name, you may step through and find her again, waiting, as she always has. And as you sit beside the pool, with no need to speak or stir, you may realize that the garden does not keep time, it keeps only presence. The moment before memory becomes story, the space where the car rests in peace, not because it has earned it, but because it was never meant to fight. And in that quiet, soft as silt, the still water listens. The Cartouche, with no name, in the limestone hills beyond Abydos, where the cliffs rise, like broken teeth against the blue sky, and vultures glide soundlessly on updrafts, there lies a passageway known only to a few. It is not marked on temple walls. It does not appear on the scrolls in the House of Life. But the sand remembers it, and those who walk without maps sometimes find it by accident, though they rarely know what they've found. The entrance is nothing more than a seam in the rock, a dark slit just wide enough to squeeze through if one dares. There are no torches, no guard statues, just cool air that smells of copper and crushed cedar, and the faint sound of dripping water echoing from somewhere far below. Inside, the light fades quickly, swallowed by layers of shadow that feel more like sleep than darkness. The walls are smooth but uncarved, as if no one ever expected this place to be seen. And yet, deep within, past several narrow turns and a stairway carved in silence, there lies a single chamber. Its ceiling is low, its air is thick. But the thing that draws all eyes, should anyone ever reach it, is the massive stone panel that fills the far wall, a cartouche, twice the height of a man. Carved with such precision, it appears as if it were poured, not chiseled. Its shape is perfect, its edges untouched by time, and inside the oval, nothing. No glyphs, no symbols, no falcon or sun disk, no throne name or birth name, just the outline of what should have been. It is said that when the first explorers found this place, long before dynasties fell, long before the Greeks came, one among them was a priest of Thoth, trained in the reading of time. He stared at the cartouche for hours, unmoving, then finally said, "This is the name of one who was never meant to be named." He refused to return to the surface. He stayed below for days, writing on scraps of bark and linen, until his ink ran dry. When he finally emerged, he said nothing to the others. He walked into the desert, barefoot, and vanished beyond the dunes. The chamber remained hidden for centuries, visited only by whispers, but in the reign of a forgotten king, whose monuments were later defaced, there came another. This king had ruled wisely, but with a weariness that no feast or festival could cure. His face had grown hollow. His dreams, brittle. He spoke less and watched the stars more. He commissioned no statues. He wrote no decrees. His only command, one quiet summer, was for a single caravan to be prepared, with no banners and few men. They set out into the desert without a destination, and after 2 days of wandering, they found the seam in the rock. Some say he had always known where it was. He entered alone, carrying only a sealed scroll and a single oil lamp. His guards waited. They waited until morning, then until the second morning, but the king did not return. When at last they followed, they found the chamber and the cartouche. Only now, it bore something. Not a name, not a word, but the faintest mark, like a shallow scratch made by a trembling hand. It was not written in hieroglyphs. It was not any language at all, just a crooked shape that curved downward and ended abruptly, as if stopped mid-thought. The guards fled. The chamber was sealed with stone, and its location lost once more. But the story of the blank cartouche lingered. Scribes began to whisper of it as a curse, not because of what it said, but because of what it refused to say. A name unspoken is a name unprotected. A soul unnamed is a soul unanchored, and it is believed, even now, that the one who left no mark continues to wander. Some said he had tried to erase his own fate. Others believed he had uncovered a name that did not belong in this world, a name older than the gods, a thought so heavy it could not be carried in speech, only buried in stone. Years passed, dynasties shifted, language changed, but every few generations, someone would speak of a king who heard his true name whispered in the dark, and followed it into silence. One record, almost burned in a temple fire, described a young girl from the western marshes who painted a cartouche in the sand with no symbols inside. When asked who it belonged to, she said, "The one who is always listening." When her family returned to that spot days later, the cartouche had been washed away by wind, but where it had been, the ground had sunk slightly, like a breath taken in secret. Some scholars believe the empty cartouche is a metaphor, a warning, a philosophical device to remind us that even the mightiest rulers vanish in time, their names smoothed down to silence. But others know better. They have seen things, heard stories, been followed by dreams in which no faces appear, only shapes that move like shadows behind curtains of sand. They say that if you ever come across a rock in the desert that seems to hum with stillness, if your dreams begin to carry the same sound night after night, you may be drawing close to the place. And if you ever see a cartouche carved with nothing at all, leave at once. Do not speak your name aloud, do not whisper to the statues, and above all do not listen too closely, because the one who lives inside that silence may be listening back, and he remembers every name but his own. The priest who never spoke. South of the old capital, where the river narrows and the reeds grow thick along its shoulders, there once stood a temple made of black stone, not limestone or whitewashed sandstone like so many others, but dark basalt quarried from a place even the quarrymen feared. It was colder to the touch than stone should ever be in the desert, and even at midday it cast no reflection on the water beside it. Locals never spoke its name. They walked wide around its walls, and fishermen would row their boats upstream rather than float past it in silence. The temple had no carvings, no banners, no statues at the gate. Only a single column at the center of its facade, where a thin symbol had been etched, an eye that looked neither open nor closed, hovering above a still line, neither sky nor earth. It was not a temple for the people, only one priest served within it, and he was unlike any others. He was known when spoken of at all, as the Silent One. No one remembered where he came from. No family, no house of learning, no initiation rites ever recorded. He simply appeared one year, during the Nile's second flood, and entered the temple as if it had always been waiting for him. He never came to the market. He never took tribute from the palace. But he was not poor. He had what he needed. Herbs, ink, oil, and salt. These were brought by quiet hands, never the same twice, and left on the temple's stone threshold. No one ever saw him eat, and yet his shadow moved behind the high, narrow windows each morning, and again before dusk. It was said he never spoke a word. Not to passers-by, not to the high priests of other cities, not even to the pharaoh when the king himself once arrived in a gilded boat. Curious to know what secrets the temple held, the pharaoh entered. He stayed inside for many hours. When he emerged, he gave no command, wrote no decree, and never spoke of the visit again. But he aged quickly after that. His attendants said he began to keep a brazier burning in his room, even in the heat, and he could often be found gazing out over the river, lips moving silently, as if repeating something he'd heard in a dream. Whatever had been spoken, if it was speech at all, was not meant to be repeated. Inside the temple, beneath its smooth black walls, there were no idols. There was, instead, a chamber of 7 alcoves, each holding a stone basin no wider than a man's chest, and in each basin, something different. Salt, ash, honey, blood, a single drop of resin. Water from the well that had dried 2 dynasties ago, and in the last, a small circle of sand, forever undisturbed, though no wind reached it. The priest would stand before each one every morning, hands clasped, eyes half shut, and sometimes, though rarely, he would hum. It was not a melody, it was not beautiful, it was something much older than that. A vibration, more felt than heard, that lingered in the ribs and behind the eyes. Those who heard it often forgot their own names for a time. On one occasion, many years after his arrival, the priest allowed a young scribe to enter. No one knew why. The boy had not asked. He had only waited at the threshold for 3 days and 3 nights, speaking nothing, writing nothing, eating nothing, and on the 4th dawn, the door was open. What he saw inside was never recorded, but when he returned, his scrolls were filled with strange geometry, circles within lines that led to points with no center, 1,000 small shapes that looped but never closed. When asked what they meant, he said only, "They are names, but not names for people, names for moments, for pieces of silence, for things the gods created, but never finished." He died before the year ended. No sign of illness, no wound, his body was whole, but his heart had stopped sometime during a dream, and in his clenched hand was a scrap of linen. On it, drawn in ink that had long faded, was the same eye carved above the temple door. After that, the temple was declared forbidden by royal decree, yet the priest remained, unmoved, unbothered. Years passed, the river shifted. Cities grew and fell, the Black Temple stayed. Once every few decades, a storm would pass across the region. No lightning, no rain, just wind and dust. It would strike without warning, and when it passed, someone would vanish. Always one person, a fisherman, a widow, a prince, and days later, someone would say they'd seen a figure in black robes walking the bank of the river, barefoot, always heading south. When asked what the figure looked like, those who saw it would pause, then shake their heads. "I don't remember," they would say, "but I feel like I dreamed of them before I was born." There were stories too about what the priest was waiting for. Some said he was not a man at all, but a fragment of something that had fallen from the stars. Others believed he was the last speaker of a language older than speech, sent to keep a word sealed until the world was quiet enough to hear it again. And there are those who believe the priest is still waiting. That deep in the dark of the basalt temple, surrounded by bowls that never empty, and silence that never rests, he is watching. Not the world, but time itself, waiting for it to fold back, waiting for the first sound ever spoken to echo one final time, and fall still. And when that day comes, it is said the temple's eye will close, and the silent one will speak.